He was the man you'd stop for on a dark road. A handsome law student with a blue-eyed gaze and a gentle, self-deprecating smile. He was the guy who could quote law textbooks by day and save lives on a suicide hotline by night. But beneath the beige turtleneck and the charming facade lay a void where a soul should have been. For years, Ted Bundy didn't just kill, he performed. He used the world's trust as his ultimate weapon, turning the vast American landscape into his personal hunting ground. He wasn't just a monster in the shadows, he was the shadow standing right next to you. This is the exhaustive, bone-chilling account of the man who wore the mask of sanity better than anyone in history, and the beautiful, vibrant lives he tried to erase. The 1970s in America is often remembered through a hazy lens of disco, bell-bottoms, and a newfound sense of social liberation. But beneath that veneer of freedom, a new kind of darkness was taking root in the American consciousness. It was a time before DNA profiling, before centralized police databases, and before the term serial killer had even entered the common lexicon. People still left their front doors unlocked. Women walked alone on college campuses at night, trusting in the inherent goodness of their fellow citizens. It was into this world of innocence that Theodore Robert Bundy stepped, carrying with him a level of depravity that would eventually shatter the nation's sense of safety forever. To understand the monster, one must look at the man he pretended to be. Ted Bundy wasn't the typical social outcast associated with violent crime. He was articulate, politically ambitious, and possessed a charismatic magnetism that drew people to him. He was a man who seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, a man who belonged in the halls of power rather than the back of a police cruiser. But this was his greatest trick, the mask of sanity. While his peers were studying for exams and planning their careers, Bundy was studying the vulnerabilities of women, refining a predatory ritual that would span multiple states and leave a trail of broken families and empty graves in its wake. The origin of his darkness is often traced back to a childhood built on a foundation of lies. Born in a home for unwed mothers in Vermont, Ted was raised believing his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was his older sister, and his grandparents were his parents. This fundamental deception, a secret held by his family to avoid the social stigma of the 1940s, would eventually become a cornerstone of his fractured identity. When he finally learned the truth as a teenager, the revelation didn't just hurt, it calcified something within him. He began to view the world as a place where everything was a performance, where the truth was whatever you could convince people to believe. As he grew older, Bundy became a social climber. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied psychology and eventually law. He worked on political campaigns for the Republican Party, rubbing shoulders with the state's elite. He was a man who craved status, yet he always felt like an outsider looking through a window. He was a mimic, learning how to dress, how to speak, and how to smile from the people he admired, but never truly feeling the emotions that went along with those actions. This ability to mimic normalcy became his primary hunting tool. He didn't have to hide in the bushes. He could walk right up to his victims and ask them for help. The first recorded victims appeared in the damp, evergreen-shrouded corridors of Washington state in early 1974. The disappearances were baffling. Young, beautiful women, often with long hair parted in the middle, began to vanish from their dorm rooms and parking lots without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no screams heard in the night. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the Pacific Northwest mist. But to talk about these vanishings without talking about who these women were is to let Bundy win his game of objectification. They were not victims or targets. They were daughters, sisters, dreamers, and the center of people's universes. Take Linda Ann Healy. She was only 21 years old, a senior at the University of Washington, majoring in psychology. Linda was a woman of routine and passion. She loved music, she was a skilled dancer, and every morning, she woke up early to broadcast the ski reports on a local radio station. Her voice was the first thing many in Seattle heard as they started their day, a voice full of warmth, youth, and promise. Linda also dedicated her free time to working with mentally disabled children, showing a depth of empathy that her killer could only mimic. On the night of January 31st, 1974, that bright, compassionate life was violently interrupted. She was taken from her basement bedroom while her roommates slept just a few feet away. The only thing left behind was a neatly made bed and a small blood stain on her pillow. Her family was left with a morning radio slot that went silent and a void that could never be filled. Then there was Susan Elaine Rancourt, just 18 years old. Susan was a biology student at Central Washington State College. She was a track star with a bright future, known by her friends and family as an incredibly cautious person. She wasn't someone who took risks. She loved animals and dreamed of a career where she could heal and protect. On the evening of April 17, 1974, Susan was walking across campus after a dormitory meeting. She was carrying a box of laundry soap in her coat. She never made it to her destination. Her caution, her athleticism, her dreams of saving lives, none of it could save her from a predator who weaponized her own kindness against her. As the months passed, the list grew heavier. Roberta Kathleen Parks was a 22-year-old student at Oregon State University. Roberta was a sensitive soul, an art major who loved poetry and painting. At the time of her disappearance, she was going through a difficult time, having just experienced a breakup and feeling the isolating weight of being away from home. She went for a walk to clear her mind on a cool May evening. She was looking for peace, but she found a monster instead. Her father, already in poor health, suffered a massive heart attack upon learning of her disappearance, a physical manifestation of the broken hearts Bundy left in his wake. Brenda Carroll Ball was 22, a free spirit who loved the outdoors and was known for her infectious laugh. She was a young woman who was always ready to chat, always ready to make a new friend. She was last seen leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington, after chatting with a handsome man with his arm in a sling. Brenda thought she was helping a stranger in need. She didn't know that her kindness was the bait in a trap. And then there was Georgianne Hawkins. Georgianne was 18, a vibrant, popular student and a member of the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. On the night of June 11, 1974, she was walking the short distance between a friend's fraternity house and her own sorority. It was a well-lit path she had walked dozens of times. She was only a few feet from safety when she vanished. Her mother, Edie Hawkins, would later talk about the horrible, heavy silence that followed. Georgianne was a girl who had everything to live for, a girl whose presence lit up a room, and her loss left the University of Washington campus in a state of absolute paralysis. The audacity of the killer reached its peak on a scorching July day at Lake Sammamish State Park. In the middle of a crowded beach, under the bright summer sun, with thousands of people laughing, swimming, and enjoying the holiday air, two young women vanished within hours of each other. This was the day that the horror became undeniable. The first was Janice Ott. Janice was 23 years old, a newlywed and a dedicated caseworker who spent her days helping underprivileged children. She was a woman of deep social conscience, someone who wanted to leave the world better than she found it. She was at the beach alone that day because her husband was studying. Witnesses remembered a handsome man in a tan outfit approaching her, his arm in a sling, asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. Janice, being the helpful, caring soul she was, agreed to assist him. She walked away with him, leaving her bicycle and her belongings on the sand. She never returned to the husband who was waiting for her to come home. Just 4 hours later, in that same crowded park, 19-year-old Denise Naslund disappeared. Denise was a fashion student, full of life, energy, and a love for music. She was at the park with her boyfriend and another couple. At around 4:30 p.m., she left the group to use the restroom, telling them she would be right back. She was a young woman who was fiercely loved, especially by her mother, Eleanor, who later described Denise as her best friend. Denise didn't come back. She was intercepted by the same man with the sling. In broad daylight, surrounded by people, the predator snatched two distinct, beautiful futures and reduced them to headlines. Eleanor Naslund would spend the rest of her life haunted by that sunny afternoon, fighting through unimaginable grief to make sure her daughter was never forgotten. The police sketch of Ted was circulated, and his name began to appear in tips. His own girlfriend, Elizabeth Clopfer, even called the police after noticing a hatchet under the seat of his car and a bowl of house keys in his apartment. But the police couldn't fathom that this clean-cut law student, a man who worked on a suicide prevention hotline alongside future crime writer Ann Rule, could be the monster they were looking for. They looked at his resume and saw a citizen. They looked at the sketch and saw a coincidence. Bundy, sensing the net tightening, didn't stop. He simply moved the hunting grounds. He packed his bags, packed his Volkswagen and took his darkness to Utah. In late 1974, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. Within weeks of his arrival, women began to disappear in Utah and Colorado. The pattern remained the same, but the stakes were getting higher. He was becoming more brazen, and his need to dominate was growing. On November 8, 1974, Bundy made a rare mistake. He approached Carol Duranch at a shopping mall in Murray, Utah. Posing as a police officer, complete with a fake badge, he told her someone had tried to break into her car and that she needed to come to the station to file a report. Carol was only 18 years old, a quiet, gentle girl. Trusting the authority figure, she got into his Volkswagen. But as he drove, her instincts began to scream. He was heading in the wrong direction, bypassing the police station entirely. When he pulled over and tried to slap handcuffs on her, the mask finally slipped, and the terrifying reality set in. Carol fought with everything she had. She didn't just scream, she battled him in the confined space of that car. She managed to pull the door handle, leap from the moving vehicle, and flag down a passing motorist. She was the first to escape his clutches and live to tell the story. Carol's bravery cannot be overstated. Because she fought, because she survived, the police finally had a living witness who could describe the killer's face, his car, and his method. But the trauma Carol carried was immense. She had to live with the memory of those cold eyes and the sound of the handcuffs clicking. Even with Carol's escape, the tragedy of that night wasn't over. Frustrated by his failure, Bundy drove to a nearby high school where a play was letting out. There he found 17-year-old Debbie Kent. Debbie was a vibrant high school senior, a girl who was loved by her classmates, a dancer and a musician. She left the school auditorium to pick up her brother, intending to return in just a few minutes. She never walked back through those doors. Her parents were left sitting in the auditorium, watching the stage, wondering why their daughter's seat was empty. Bundy's time in Colorado brought more heartbreak. Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse, went to get a magazine from the lobby of the resort where she was staying with her fiancé. She was a woman who dedicated her life to healing others, a nurse full of compassion and energy. She walked down a well-lit hallway and vanished into the mountain night. Her loss devastated her family and her fiancé, turning a vacation into a waking nightmare. There was also Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a local police chief, and Laura Aim, also 17. These were girls with deep roots in their communities, girls who were cherished by their parents and admired by their peers. Their deaths turned quiet mountain towns into places of suspicion and dread. After being captured in 1975 on a routine traffic stop and subsequently convicted of the Duranch kidnapping, Bundy was extradited to Colorado to face murder charges for Karen Campbell. But his narcissism wouldn't let him stay in a cell. Acting as his own attorney, he jumped from a courthouse window in 1977, was caught, and then on New Year's Eve of that same year, pulled off his most famous escape. He starved himself until he could fit through a hole in the ceiling of his cell, dropped into the jailer's apartment, and walked out into the cold Colorado night. He fled to Florida, arriving in Tallahassee under an alias. He wanted a fresh start, a place where no one knew the name Ted. But the hunger that drove him hadn't stayed behind in the mountains. It had only grown more feral, more desperate, and more brutal. The Florida chapter of Bundy's life is perhaps the most devastating because it shows a complete abandonment of the charming ruse in favor of pure, unadulterated savagery. On the night of January 15, 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Inside were young women asleep, dreaming of their futures. In a matter of minutes, Bundy attacked 4 of them. Margaret Bowman, 21 years old, was an art history major. She was a creative soul, a young woman described as elegant and kind, with a deep love for her family. She was murdered in her bed. Lisa Levy, 20, was a fashion merchandising student. She was full of spark, a girl with a bright smile who was known as a joyful, loving friend. She was also murdered. 2 other women, Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, survived the brutal attacks, but were left with horrific physical and emotional scars that would take a lifetime to heal. Bundy didn't use a cast that night. He didn't ask for help. He was no longer playing the part of the handsome law student. He was a monster in the dark, destroying lives in a place where these women felt the most secure. But the absolute peak of his depravity came a few weeks later. On February 9th, 1978, Florida, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Kimberly was just a child. She was in the 7th grade, a girl who loved horses, was a member of the school band, and was a typical innocent 12-year-old. On that day, she had forgotten her purse in a classroom and went back to retrieve it. She was seen being led away by a man toward a white van. For weeks, the community searched for her, holding on to a desperate hope that this little girl would be found safe. But that hope was crushed when her body was found in a state park. The emotional weight of Kimberly's death is staggering. She was a child with her whole life ahead of her, a life of proms, graduations, first loves, and growing old, all violently stolen by a man who saw her only as an object to satisfy his dark impulses. Her family was shattered. Her community was broken. Of all the lives Ted Bundy took, the image of that innocent 12-year-old girl is perhaps the most painful reminder of the pure evil that lived behind his smile. The investigation that followed in Florida was one of the most intense in history. When Bundy was finally pulled over in a stolen car in Pensacola, the hunt was over, but the spectacle was just beginning. The trial was a media circus, the first to be televised nationally. Bundy played to the cameras, proposed marriage to Carol Ann Boone in the middle of the courtroom, and continued to insist on his innocence. He wanted the world to look at him, to be fascinated by him. He treated the courtroom like a stage and the jury like an audience. But the real story of those trials wasn't Bundy's antics. It was the physical evidence that finally spoke for the victims. The bite mark left on Lisa Levy was matched perfectly to Bundy's unique, crooked teeth. It was a physical signature that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. He was sentenced to death multiple times. For 9 years, he lived on death row, utilizing every legal trick to stay alive. It was only when the end was certain that he began to talk. He sat with investigators, finally dropping the third-person narrative he had used for years. He described the entity inside him, the impulse that forced him to seek out victims. He confessed to over 30 murders, though many believe the true number is much higher, perhaps closer to 100. He spoke of the locations of the body dumps he had created across the West. He was a man trying to buy time with the lives he had stolen, but the clock had finally run out. As we approach the end of this account, we have to talk about the Bundy phenomenon, the way he has been romanticized and mythologized in the years since his death. We see movies, documentaries, and books that focus on his brilliance or his charm. But we must ask ourselves, what is charming about a man who murders a 12-year-old girl? What is brilliant about a man who can only feel powerful by destroying those weaker than him? The myth of Bundy as a genius is another lie he told, one that we have unfortunately continued to repeat. He wasn't a genius. He was a predator who took advantage of a world that wasn't prepared for him. He was a man who used the kindness and trust of others as a weapon. The real brilliance, the real strength lay in the women he took. It lay in Linda's music, Susan's track records, Roberta's poetry, Janice's social work, and Denise's laughter. It lay in Carol Duranche's courage to jump from a moving car and Kathy Kleiner's will to recover. These are the people who deserve our fascination. They represent the best of us, the empathy, the ambition, and the resilience of the human spirit. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, a crowd gathered outside the Florida State Prison. They weren't there to mourn, they were there to celebrate. They carried signs that said, "Burn Bundy, burn," and "Toast Ted." Inside, the man who had terrified a nation was led to Old Sparky. For the first time, there were no cameras for him to play to, no law books to cite, and no fake casts to wear. The mask was finally gone, leaving only a terrified man facing the void he had created for so many others. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. His ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, the very place where his spree had begun. But while the man is gone, the impact of his crimes remains. He changed the way women lived their lives. He changed the way police investigated murders. And he taught the world a terrifying lesson, that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a friend. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. We often talk about the Bundy case as if it's a legend, but for the families of the women he took, it is a permanent echoing silence. They remember the girls who never came home from class, the sisters who never got to be bridesmaids, and the daughters who were never allowed to grow old. To look at the pictures of these women is to see a generation of stolen potential. They were vibrant, intelligent, full of love, and deeply connected to their families and communities. Bundy did not create a legacy, he created a wake of broken hearts. He was a thief of futures. In the decades since his execution, the world has become a different place. Forensic science has advanced beyond what anyone in 1974 could have imagined. DNA, digital footprints, and integrated databases make it harder for a predator like Bundy to move through the shadows. But the psychological lessons remain. The mask of sanity is a real phenomenon, a warning that the most dangerous people are often the ones who blend in the best. Bundy proved that charisma is not a virtue, it is a tool, and in the hands of a monster, it is a deadly one. We must continue to tell these stories, not to glorify the killer, but to remember the lost. We must talk about the victims as more than just names on a list. We must talk about their lives, their dreams, and the immense loss their absence created. By doing so, we reclaim the narrative. We take the spotlight away from the man in the beige turtleneck and shine it on the people who truly deserved it. Let us remember their names, not his. Let us remember Linda Ann Healy, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks, Brenda Carroll Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Nasland, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Aim, Debbie Kent, Karen Campbell, Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach. They are the lives that were sacrificed to the vanity of a man who wanted to be a star. Their memories are the light that pushes back against the dark shadow he tried to cast over a generation. As the sun sets on this account, we honor them. We remember the dancers, the students, the artists, the daughters, and the little girl with the horse-patterned notebooks. They are the ones who matter. They are the ones who, in the end, won the battle for the truth. Justice was slow, and the cost was unimaginable, but the light has finally, eternally returned to the places where they once smiled. Sleep well, knowing their names are etched not in infamy, but in love. Their stories will be told long after the name of their killer has faded into the static of history. They are the legacy, they are the light, and they will never ever be forgotten. As we reach the final minutes of this journey, we reflect on the resilience of the human heart. Despite the horror Bundy unleashed, the families of these women found ways to go on. They founded scholarships in their daughters' names. They fought for better victim advocacy laws. They turned their unimaginable pain into a force for good. This is the ultimate defeat of Ted Bundy. He wanted to destroy, but the love his victims left behind proved indestructible. He wanted to be remembered as a master of law and charm, but he is remembered only as a warning. The American landscape is vast, and its history is filled with both great light and deep shadows. Ted Bundy was one of those shadows, a dark reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight. But the light of these women, their lives, their spirits, and the love they shared, continues to burn bright. It is a light that no mask can hide and no darkness can extinguish. We end this story not with the death of a monster, but with the eternal life of his victims. They are the stars in the night sky over the Cascades, the Rockies, and the Florida coast. They are home, they are at peace, and they are loved. The performance is over. The curtain has fallen. The house lights are up. And the monster who wore the mask of sanity is nothing more than a ghost in the static of history. He thought he was a legend, but he was just a man who forgot that the world is built on more than just lies. It is built on the love and the memory of those he could never truly take away. Justice was slow, and the cost was unimaginable, but the light has finally, eternally returned. We remember them today, tomorrow, and forever. Their names are the final word. Their lives are the ultimate truth, and in that truth, there is a peace that no evil can ever touch again. The silence of the evergreen forests is no longer heavy with dread. It is filled with the memory of the laughter that was once there. The campuses of the University of Washington, Florida State, and the University of Utah are places of learning and life again. The shadow has receded, the hunt is over, and as we close this chapter, let us hold our loved ones a little closer, listen to our instincts a little more carefully, and never forget that the greatest power we have is the power of our own humanity. That is something Ted Bundy could never understand, and it is the reason why, in the end, he lost. The truth found him, the law caught him, and the memory of his victims outshines his darkness every single day. This has been the story of the man who wore the mask, but more importantly, it has been the story of the light that unmasked him. May we always remember the difference. May we always honor the fallen, and may we always strive to live in a world where the mask of sanity is recognized for what it is, and where the lives of the innocent are protected by the strength of our collective memory and our unwavering commitment to justice. For Linda, Susan, Denise, Kimberly, and all the others, this is for you. Your light remains, your story is told, and you are forever home. Imagine Georgianne Hawkins on that final night. She was wearing a white t-shirt and a pair of bell-bottom jeans. She was happy, having just finished her exams. She was chatting with a friend, laughing about something small and insignificant, the way 18-year-olds do. She was so close to her sorority house, only 12 feet away. In the time it takes to draw a breath, she was gone. Think of the cookies her mother had sent her in a care package that was still sitting on her desk, unopened. Think of the letters she had written to her boyfriend that were never mailed. These are the details that break the heart. Think of Debbie Kent's parents, Belva and Jerry, sitting in that high school auditorium. They were waiting for their daughter to come back and take her seat. The play continued. The actors spoke their lines, the audience clapped, and all the while their daughter was being driven away into the dark. They waited until the lights came up and the room was empty, still hoping to see her walk through the door. That wait lasted for decades. It is a silence that no execution can ever truly break. This is the true cost of Ted Bundy. It isn't just the lives taken, it's the future stolen, the families shattered, and the innocence of a nation lost. But in remembering them, in speaking their names with love and respect, we ensure that the monster never gets the last word. The last word belongs to them. It belongs to the love they gave and the light they left behind. And that light is beautiful, it is eternal, and it is finally at peace. Imagine for a moment a man who represents everything society tells us to respect. He is a genius with an IQ that nears the level of a prodigy. He is a dedicated professional, a computer programmer who spends his days navigating the complex logic of the early digital age. He is politically active, a clean-cut veteran of the Air Force, and a man known for his polite, quiet demeanor. But as night falls over the sun-drenched highways of Southern California, this man undergoes a transformation that defies logic. While the world sleeps, he turns the coastal roads into a hunting ground, carrying with him a handwritten list, a coded scorecard of death. For over a decade, he moves through the shadows of Orange County, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable cruelty that would eventually earn him the title of the Scorecard Killer. This is not just a story of murder, it is a descent into the mind of a man who proved that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who look exactly like us. The story of Randy Kraft begins not in the darkness, but in the sterile, hopeful atmosphere of post-war America. Born in 1945 in Long Beach, California, Kraft was the definition of a high achiever. He grew up in a stable, middle-class home in Westminster, a boy who seemed destined for greatness. He was a bright student, a member of the Boy Scouts, and a young man who took a keen interest in the political landscape of his time. Those who knew him in high school remembered him as a debater, someone who could outthink almost anyone in the room. He was the kind of person who seemed to have a map for his life, a clear trajectory towards success. After graduating, he attended Claremont Men's College, where he worked on the school paper and became a staunch supporter of conservative politics. To his peers, Randy Kraft was the embodiment of the American dream, intelligent, focused, and destined for a career that would make his family proud. However, beneath this polished exterior, there was a fracturing of identity that Kraft kept hidden from the world. In the mid-1960s, while the country was embroiled in cultural revolution, Kraft joined the Air Force. It was a move that fit his disciplined image, but it was during this time that his internal contradictions began to surface. He was eventually discharged on medical grounds related to his sexuality. A moment that could have been a turning point but instead became a catalyst for a deeper, more private withdrawal. He returned to civilian life and found success in the burgeoning field of computer programming. He was good at it, very good. He was a man who understood systems, codes, and logic. But the logic he was beginning to apply to his private life was becoming increasingly dark and predatory. The transformation from a law-abiding citizen to a serial killer is rarely a sudden leap. It is a slow erosion of empathy. For Kraft, the obsession began to manifest in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He started frequenting the bars and hitchhiking corridors of Southern California, looking for young men who were vulnerable, soldiers on leave, young drifters and hitchhikers trying to navigate the coastal sprawl. His intelligence became his most lethal weapon. He didn't look like a threat. He was clean-shaven, well-spoken, and drove a nice car. He offered a ride, a beer, and a moment of friendly conversation. To his victims, he was a helping hand, a way to get from point A to point B. They had no way of knowing that they were stepping into a mobile chamber of horrors. The methodology Kraft employed was calculated to maximize control and suffering. He would often drug his victims, using a combination of alcohol and powerful sedatives to render them helpless. Once they were incapacitated, the polite computer programmer vanished, replaced by a sadist who took pleasure in the slow, methodical torture of those in his power. He utilized the vast, lonely stretches of the California highway system as his theater. He would drive for hours, his victims drifting in and out of consciousness, while he performed acts of unimaginable cruelty. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to dominate the very essence of the human being in his passenger seat. When he was finished, he would discard the bodies along the freeway ramps and side roads, often posing them in ways that were designed to shock and humiliate even in death. By the mid-1970s, the highway of death in Southern California was becoming a source of terror for local law enforcement. Bodies were appearing with disturbing frequency. Young men, often stripped of their clothing, their lives snuffed out by strangulation or internal trauma. The investigators at the time were struggling. This was an era before DNA profiling, before centralized computer databases, and before the term serial killer was even a common part of the lexicon. Kraft was a phantom. He never stayed in one place. He never left a consistent signature that the technology of the time could track. And he was careful. He went to work every day, he paid his taxes, and he even had a long-term partner who had no idea that the man he shared a home with was spending his weekends dumping bodies in the brush of Orange County. What makes the case of Randy Kraft uniquely chilling is the scorecard. Discovered much later, this was a cryptic, handwritten list found in his car. It contained nearly 70 entries, brief phrases that served as a coded diary of his crimes. Entries like Marine Head, Stable, Portland Blood, and Easter were the only records of the human lives he had extinguished. To Kraft, these men weren't human beings with families, dreams, and futures. They were entries in a ledger, points on a scoreboard of his own making. The list suggested a scale of murder that was almost impossible to fathom. While investigators could only definitively link him to a handful of cases initially, the scorecard hinted at a decade-long reign of terror that spanned multiple states, including Oregon and Michigan. The emotional toll on the families of the victims was, and remains, immeasurable. Imagine a young Marine, having survived the rigors of training, hitchhiking home for the holidays, only to vanish into the California night. Imagine a mother waiting for a phone call that never comes, her son's name eventually becoming a John Doe in a cold case file. Kraft didn't just take lives, he stole the peace of entire communities. He targeted young men in the prime of their lives, many of whom were serving their country, and he did so with a detachment that is bone-chilling. He viewed himself as superior, a man who could outsmart the police and the common people he hunted. This narcissism was the fuel for his longevity. He believed he was untouchable because he was the smartest person in the room. The beginning of the end for Randy Kraft came on a mundane night in May 1983. It wasn't a high-stakes detective stakeout or a brilliant forensic breakthrough that caught him. It was a simple traffic stop. Two California Highway Patrol officers noticed a brown Toyota Celica weaving erratically on Interstate 5 near Mission Viejo. They suspected a drunk driver. The man behind the wheel was polite, almost dismissive. It was Randy Kraft. He failed the field sobriety test, but as the officers began to search the vehicle, they noticed something in the passenger seat. There was a young man slumped over, his eyes open but unseeing. His name was Terry Gambrell, a 25-year-old Marine. He was dead. His pants were around his ankles, and there were signs of strangulation. The mask finally shattered. As investigators searched the rest of the car, the horror of Kraft's secret life began to spill out. Under the floor mat, they found the scorecard. In the trunk, they found a collection of photographs. Dozens of pictures of young men in various states of undress and death. These were his trophies, the visual evidence of the moments he had spent owning his victims. They found clothing that didn't belong to him, jewelry taken from the dead, and the powerful drugs he used to sedate his prey. The polite programmer was gone, replaced by a man who is now the primary suspect in one of the largest murder investigations in history. The trial of Randy Kraft was a grueling descent into darkness for everyone involved. It lasted for over a year, becoming one of the most expensive and complex trials in California history. The evidence was overwhelming, yet Kraft remained stoic, showing no remorse and no emotion as the details of his crimes were read aloud. The prosecution focused on 16 specific murders, though the scorecard suggested many more. They presented the photographs, the testimony of the officers who found him with Gambrell, and the harrowing forensic evidence of the torture he inflicted. The jury heard how he had mutilated his victims, how he had used fire and ligatures to prolong their agony, and how he had meticulously recorded each death in his coded list. In 1989, Randy Kraft was convicted of 16 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But the story doesn't end with a sentence. For decades, Kraft has sat on death row at San Quentin State Prison, utilizing his high intelligence to navigate the appeals process. He has spent more time on death row than many of his victims were alive. He remains a figure of intense study for criminal psychologists, a man who represents the organized serial killer in its most terrifying form. He wasn't a man driven by a sudden loss of sanity. He was a man who chose violence, who planned it, and who executed it with the same precision he used to write computer code. The legacy of Randy Kraft is a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist in our society. He thrived in a time when hitchhiking was common and the world felt smaller, yet more disconnected. He exploited the trust of young men who were looking for a ride or a friend. He proved that a high IQ is not a shield against depravity, and that success in one's professional life can be the perfect cover for a life of absolute evil. As we look back on the highway of death, we must remember the names that Kraft tried to turn into codes. We must remember Terry Gambrell, Edward Daniel Moore, Keith Crotwell, and the dozens of others who fell victim to the man with the scorecard. The victims of Randy Kraft were more than just entries on a list. They were sons who loved their parents, brothers who looked out for their siblings, and friends who had their whole lives ahead of them. Each code on that scorecard represents a unique human experience that was violently extinguished. When we speak of serial killers, we often focus on the perpetrator, but the true story lies in the absence left behind. It lies in the empty chairs at Thanksgiving, the unopened Christmas presents, and the decades of what-ifs that haunt the survivors. Randy Kraft took more than just lives. He took the future from dozens of families, and he did so with a smirk and a shrug. The emotional weight of the Kraft case is also found in the detectives who spent years trying to catch a ghost. They were men and women who went home every night haunted by the images of the young men they found in the brush. They were the ones who had to tell parents that their sons were never coming home. The frustration of knowing a predator was out there, but having no way to track him across the vast California landscape is a trauma that stays with an investigator for life. The Kraft case helped change the way serial murders are investigated, leading to better interagency cooperation and the development of the very databases that Kraft thought he could outrun. As the years pass, the name Randy Kraft becomes a dark footnote in the history of California, but the lessons of his crimes remain relevant. He is a reminder that we must look beyond the surface of the successful and the polite. He is a reminder that the digital age he helped build can also be used to track the very monsters it once helped hide. San Quentin remains his home, a place where he waits for a finality that he denied to so many others. He is an old man now, his physical strength gone, but the scorecard he wrote remains as a testament to a decade of darkness. To truly understand the horror of the scorecard killer, one must contemplate the silence of the highway. Think of the late-night drives along the PCH, the wind through the windows, and the feeling of freedom that the open road represents. For Randy Kraft's victims, that freedom was a trap, the very thing that defines the American spirit. The ability to travel and to trust the stranger on the road was the tool he used to destroy them. He turned the journey into an end, and he did so with a cold, calculated logic that is perhaps the most frightening aspect of his character. He was a man of the system, a man of codes, and a man who believed that people were just data points to be manipulated and deleted. The story of Randy Kraft is a tragedy in every sense of the word. It is a tragedy for the victims, for their families, and for a society that was forced to realize that the most dangerous man might be the one sitting at the next desk over, or the one helping with a political campaign. It is a story that demands we remember the names of the dead, and that we never stop looking for the truth, no matter how deep it is buried in a coded list. As we close this chapter on the scorecard killer, let the light of memory stay focused on those he tried to erase. Let the names be spoken, the lives be honored, and the darkness of the scorecard be met with the unyielding light of justice. In the end, Randy Kraft is a man who thought he could outsmart destiny. He thought his intelligence made him a god, capable of deciding who lived and who died. But he was undone by the simplest of things, a traffic stop, a dead body in plain sight, and the very list he used to stroke his own ego. His arrogance was his downfall, a poetic justice for a man who viewed the world as his personal hunting ground. The scorecard is now a piece of evidence, a grim historical artifact that serves as a warning. It tells us that while evil can be organized, brilliant, and patient, it can never truly hide forever. The truth is always waiting just around the bend of the highway, ready to bring the monster into the light. As the sun sets over San Quentin, Randy Kraft remains a prisoner of the system he once navigated with ease. He is a man who spent his life creating codes, but the code of justice is the only one that finally mattered. The scorecard is closed, the victims are at peace, and the man who thought he was a genius is now just a number in a cell, waiting for the end of a story that he began so many years ago on a dark California road. Let the final word be one of remembrance for the victims, a promise that they will never be just a phrase on a list again. They were loved, they are missed, and they are finally home. The road continues, but the shadows are thinner now. The lessons of Randy Kraft are etched into the way we protect ourselves and the way we investigate the unthinkable. He was a monster who looked like a man, a programmer of death who was finally deleted from the world he tried to dominate. Let us walk forward with the awareness that beauty and horror can coexist in the same person, and let us choose the light every single time. The story of the scorecard killer is finished, but the duty to remember the victims is eternal. The intricate details of the Kraft case continue to provide a grim blueprint for the study of the organized serial killer. Unlike many who are driven by a chaotic break from reality, Kraft was a man of order. He lived a double life that was almost perfectly compartmentalized. On one side, he was the loving son who visited his parents and the reliable employee who never missed a deadline. On the other, he was a predator who kept meticulous records of his kills. This ability to switch between these two personas is what allowed him to evade capture for so long. It is a chilling reminder that the human mind is capable of harboring deep-seated depravity while maintaining a facade of absolute normalcy. When we consider the scorecard, we must also consider the psychological need that drove Kraft to keep it. For a man who viewed himself as a genius, the list was a way to quantify his success. It was a way to relive the moments of control and dominance he felt during his crimes. Each entry was a mental trigger, a way to access the dark memories he cherished. It shows a level of premeditation and post-meditation that is rare, even among serial killers. He didn't just kill in the heat of the moment, he killed to add to his collection. This collector's mentality is what makes the scorecard killer so uniquely disturbing. To him, the victims were objects, and the list was his inventory. The investigation into Kraft's crimes also highlights the incredible perseverance of the law enforcement officers involved. Despite the lack of modern tools, they followed the leads, they connected the dots where they could, and they never stopped looking for the phantom of the highway. When the break finally came, they were ready. They didn't just arrest a drunk driver. They recognized the significance of what they found in that Toyota Celica. Their quick thinking and attention to detail prevented Kraft from dumping Terry Gambrell and disappearing back into his normal life. They are the unsung heroes of this story, the ones who finally put an end to a decade of slaughter. The trial itself was a marathon of legal maneuvering. Kraft's defense team tried every possible angle to discredit the evidence in the scorecard, but the sheer weight of the photographs and the physical evidence found in his possession was insurmountable. The families of the victims had to endure months of graphic testimony, seeing the trophies Kraft had taken from their loved ones and hearing the details of their final moments. It was a secondary trauma that no family should have to face, yet they stood strong, seeking the justice that had been denied to them for so long. The conviction was a victory for them, but it was a victory tinged with the profound sadness of what had been lost. As Kraft continues to age on death row, the debate over the death penalty in California continues to swirl around him. For many, he is the prime example of why the ultimate punishment exists. For others, his decades of appeals and the state's moratorium on executions mean that he has escaped the very fate he inflicted on so many others. Regardless of the legal status of his execution, Randy Kraft remains a man condemned by history. He is a symbol of a dark era and a reminder of the vigilance required to protect the vulnerable. His name will forever be synonymous with the scorecard, a list that serves as a monument to his vanity and his cruelty. We must also reflect on the victims who were never officially linked to Kraft, but are suspected to be on his list. There are still families who look at the scorecard and wonder if their missing son is one of the entries. The ambiguity is a lingering wound, a silence that may never be fully broken. The Easter basket or the Marine head may never have a name, but they are still human beings whose lives were cut short. The tragedy of Randy Kraft is not just the 16 he was convicted of, it is the potential dozens of others who remain lost in the gaps of his coded diary. The final legacy of Randy Kraft is a call to look deeper. It is a call to value every person, regardless of their status or their situation. It is a call to ensure that the forgotten are never truly forgotten, and that the law is a shield for everyone. The scorecard killer thought he could play a game with human lives, but he forgot that the truth is not a game. It is a force that eventually breaks through every code and every facade. Randy Kraft is a prisoner of his own making, trapped in a cell and in a history that will never view him with anything but horror. The light of justice has finally reached the end of the highway, and in that light we remember the victims, we honor the truth, and we move forward into a world where the shadows are smaller. In the quiet hours of the night, when the California highways are mostly empty, the spirit of those young men remains. Not in the fear that Kraft tried to instill, but in the love that their families still carry. They are remembered in the photos on mantles, the stories told at family gatherings, and the unyielding hope that their lives had meaning beyond their tragic end. Randy Kraft tried to reduce them to a list, but he failed. They are human, they were loved, and they will always be more than just a score. This is the ultimate defeat of the scorecard killer. Not just his imprisonment, but the fact that the light of his victims' lives continues to shine long after his darkness has been contained. As we conclude this narrative, let us take a breath and appreciate the safety we often take for granted. Let us remember the vigilance of the officers who pull over a weaving car at 2:00 a.m., and the scientists who work in the labs to connect the smallest pieces of evidence. They are the barrier between us and the monsters. The story of Randy Kraft is a reminder that while evil is real, the people who fight it are more real. The light of the truth is stronger than any coded list, and the memory of the innocent is more enduring than any serial killer's fame. The road is open, the shadows are gone, and the victims are finally free from the scorecard of Randy Kraft. The end of this story is not about the man in San Quentin. It is about the world that moved on, the justice that was served, and the lives that are being lived today because a predator was removed from the highway. It is about the resilience of the human spirit and the power of memory to overcome even the deepest trauma. Randy Kraft is a ghost of a dark time, but we are the living, and we carry the flame of justice forward. Let it burn bright, let it reach every corner of the darkness, and let it ensure that the scorecard is never opened again. Finality, respect, remembrance. The scorecard killer is no more. The smell of death does not begin with the flesh. It begins with the quiet decay of human empathy in places the world has chosen to forget. In the sun-bleached, economically devastated northern suburbs of Adelaide, South Australia, during the 1990s, a group of men did something far worse than slip through the cracks of society. They built a kingdom inside them. While neighbors went to work, cashed welfare checks, and tended to their lawns, a high-tech electric grinder was being used in a dark shed, and a series of blue plastic barrels were slowly filling with the dismembered remains of the discarded. For nearly a decade, a charismatic psychopath named John Bunting and his fiercely loyal disciple, Robert Wagner, orchestrated a systematic purge of the vulnerable, turning a bankrupt town called Snowtown into the epicenter of the most horrific serial killing ring in Australian history. This is not just a story about murder, it is a forensic journey into a shared delusion, a financial web of stolen welfare, and the moment a self-proclaimed vigilante group became the very monsters they claimed to hunt. This is the dark, continuous timeline of the bodies in the barrels, where the community's silence allowed a factory of torture to operate in plain sight. To understand the sheer gravity of the horror that eventually culminated in an abandoned bank vault in 1999, one must look at the psychological landscape of Salisbury North and the man who became its undisputed dictator. John Justin Bunting was not a physically imposing man, but he possessed a terrifying magnetic charisma that preyed on the desperate, the lonely, and the uneducated. Born with a deep-seated hatred for anyone he deemed deviant, Bunting spent his youth cultivating a bizarre, twisted moral code. He despised pedophiles, homosexuals, and the weak, yet his definition of these categories was completely fluid, expanding to include anyone who crossed him or possessed money he wanted. By the early 1990s, Bunting had established himself as a dominant figure in his neighborhood, a man who listened to people's grievances and offered a dangerous form of protection. He was a master of manipulation, identifying the lonely, the easily led, and the deeply traumatized, and molding them into a makeshift family that viewed him as a savior. It was in this desperate circle that Bunting found his most devoted soldier, Robert Joe Wagner. Wagner was a man drifting through life, hollowed out by personal failures and possessing a fragile intellect that was easily overwhelmed by Bunting's fierce certainty. Where Bunting was the architect, the strategist who spun the ideological webs, Wagner became the technician of violence. He didn't just follow Bunting, he worshipped him, adopting his prejudices, his cadence, and his total lack of empathy. Bunting convinced Wagner and a small inner circle that they were cleaning up the streets, that they were a righteous committee of vigilantes executing those whom the justice system refused to punish. In reality, they were a predatory pack, using the guise of moral righteousness to indulge in a sadistic addiction to absolute control, greed, and torture. The methodology of the killings was a clinical exercise in human degradation. But to fully comprehend the tragedy, we must look directly into the lives of the people who were stolen. These are not faceless statistics. They were human beings who had names, families, favorite songs, and deep struggles. The nightmare began in earnest with a young man named Clinton Trezise. In 1992, Clinton was only 22 years old, a boy trying to find his footing in a world that offered very little support. He crossed paths with Bunting, who falsely accused him of being a pedophile to justify his own bloodlust. Clinton was lured to Bunting's home, where he was brutally struck with a shovel and killed. His body was buried in a shallow grave in the scrubland of Lower Light, forgotten by the world, but deeply missed by those who knew his quiet nature. For years, his family wondered why he had vanished, unaware that his death had just become the foundation for a serial-killing empire. As the group's confidence grew, the violence became more structured, transforming into an assembly line of death. Bunting realized that these disappearances could be incredibly profitable. The targets shifted to people within their own social orbit, the disabled, the transient, and the family members who relied on government assistance. The next person to fall into the trap was a man named Ray Davies. Ray was a gentle, intellectually disabled man who lived a solitary existence in a caravan parked in a backyard. He had no wealth, no power, and very few people to look out for him. Bunting and Wagner saw him as an easy target. They accused him of being a deviant, a lie fabricated purely to steal his meager pension payments. Ray was subjected to days of unimaginable physical torment, involving electrocution, beatings, and psychological terror. They forced him to record his voice on cassette tapes, reading scripts that claimed he was moving interstate so the police wouldn't investigate his disappearance. Once they had broken his spirit and stolen his identity, they took his life and packed his body into a plastic tub. The true scale of the depravity lay in the total betrayal of domestic bonds and long-term friendships. One of the most heartbreaking chapters in this continuous descent was the murder of Barry Lane. Barry was a vulnerable transgender woman who had been known locally as Vanessa. In a cruel twist of fate, Barry had actually been Bunting's former lover and a brief participant in the early ideological discussions of the vigilante group. But as Bunting's paranoia escalated, Barry became a liability. The friendship and intimacy they once shared meant absolutely nothing to the killers. Bunting and Wagner turned on Barry with clinical detachment. They tied her up in a bathroom and tortured her for days, using pliers and boiling water to inflict maximum agony before finally strangling her. The utter betrayal of someone who had once trusted them completely showed that Bunting and Wagner had completely severed their ties to human emotion. The circle of violence soon swallowed Thomas Trevelyan. Thomas was a young man struggling with severe psychological vulnerabilities, a boy who desperately needed a hand to hold, but instead found a predator. He had made the mistake of associating with Bunting's circle and began talking about things he shouldn't have. In 1997, his body was found hanging from a tree in the Adelaide Hills. The police initially ruled it a suicide, a tragedy that his family had to mourn in isolation, completely unaware that his death had been meticulously staged by Wagner and Bunting to silence him forever. The madness was now a self-feeding fire, and every kill required another to cover the tracks of the last. Bunting's paranoia grew alongside his body count. Anyone who showed a flicker of hesitation, anyone who questioned the righteousness of the executions, became the next entry on the hit list. This was the tragic fate of Elizabeth Hayden. Elizabeth was a kind, unassuming woman who was married to Mark Hayden, a peripheral member of the group. Elizabeth began asking too many questions about why so many people around them were suddenly deciding to pack up and move to other states without saying goodbye. Her curiosity was her death sentence. While her husband was away, Bunting and Wagner entered her home, bound her, and tortured her to death. The sheer coldness required to murder the wife of their own associate inside her own home proved that no one was safe. The bodies were no longer just a legal liability, they were becoming a logistics problem. Bunting purchased large, heavy-duty blue plastic barrels and industrial quantities of hydrochloric acid from local hardware stores, attempting to dissolve the physical evidence of his crimes. When the acid failed to destroy the heavy bone structures, the barrels became mobile tombs. They were stored in suburban sheds, moved from rental house to rental house in the back of trailers, filling the air with a faint chemical stench that neighbors assumed was nothing more than raw sewage or dead rats. The narrative reaches its absolute most devastating point with the murder of David Johnson. David was only 24 years old, and he was John Bunting's own stepson. David was a bright, trusting young man who looked up to Bunting as a father figure. He had no idea about the monsters hiding behind the faces of his family. In May 1999, Bunting and Wagner lured David to the abandoned bank building in Snowtown under the pretense of a family outing or help with a chore. Inside that cold concrete structure, they turned on him. David's own stepfather, along with Wagner, bound him to a chair. They tortured him, forcing him to give up his bank account details, ignoring his pleas for mercy and his confusion as to why the man who raised him was doing this. They strangled him, cutting short a young life full of potential, purely for a few $1,000s in a bank account. By 1998, the pressure of keeping these toxic barrels in suburban Adelaide had become too great. Bunting needed a place where the world never looked, a town so desolate that a strange smell wouldn't trigger suspicion. He found it in Snowtown, a tiny, struggling agricultural community located roughly 140 kilometers north of Adelaide. The town was a ghost of its former self, its shops boarded up and its streets empty. Bunting located an old, disused state bank building on the main street. The building was solid, constructed of thick brick with a heavy commercial concrete vault at its center. Renting the building under a false name, Bunting and Wagner transported 6 of the blue plastic barrels into the vault, closing the heavy steel door and locking the secrets away in the dark. They believed the vault was an impenetrable sanctuary, a place where their crimes would never be read, because the world had simply stopped caring about Snowtown. The breakthrough did not come from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from the slow, inevitable collapse of the financial fraud they were operating. The South Australia Police had begun investigating the unexplained disappearances of several welfare recipients, whose bank accounts were still being systematically drained through ATMs in the Adelaide suburbs. A task force named Operation Mamba was formed, and as the detectives mapped the connections between the missing people, every single thread led back to one man, John Bunting. On May 20th, 1999, acting on a tip regarding a strange rental agreement, detectives arrived at the abandoned bank in Snowtown. When they forced open the heavy vault door, the officers were hit by a wall of toxic, putrid air that caused men to retch. Inside, sitting in the dark, were the 6 blue barrels. Forensic teams wrapped in hazardous material suits spent days sifting through the soup of decomposed tissue, clothes, and matching personal items, eventually identifying the remains of 8 individuals. 2 more bodies were later found buried beneath a suburban shed in Adelaide, bringing the official count to 12 victims, though investigators believe the true tally may be higher. The arrest of John Bunting and Robert Wagner sent shockwaves across the globe, forever branding the quiet town of Snowtown with a reputation it did not earn. The trial, which began in 2001 and extended into 2003, was a grueling descent into the dark psychology of shared madness. It became the longest and most expensive trial in South Australian history. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: the cassette tapes containing the terrified weeping voices of the victims, the financial logs detailing the stolen welfare payments, and the forensic tools of torture recovered from Bunting's properties. Throughout the proceedings, Bunting remained a chilling, arrogant figure, showing no remorse and attempting to maintain the fiction that he was a societal cleaner. Wagner, completely broken away from his mentor's physical presence, appeared hollow, the realization of what he had done finally piercing through the armor of his programming. The true emotional weight of this case lies in the voices that were silenced for a decade. The victims were people who struggled with the basic mechanics of survival in a harsh, unforgiving economy. They were people who desperately needed a community to protect them, but instead, they found a community that allowed them to be harvested. The justice system eventually delivered its finality. In December 2003, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were convicted of multiple counts of murder. Bunting was sentenced to 11 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in a maximum security cell. Wagner received 10 life sentences with the same non-parole status. They were locked away in Yatala labor prison, the very system they thought they could outsmart, stripped of their power and reduced to numbers in a ledger. The deeper tragedy of Snowtown is the collective failure of observation. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of how invisible a human being can become if they are poor, disabled, or isolated. Bunting and Wagner did not just kill bodies, they exploited social abandonment. They knew that if a young man with schizophrenia or a woman living in a caravan disappeared, society would default to the assumption that they simply drifted away to another town. They used our own apathy as their camouflage. Every time an ATM card was swiped to drain a dead man's pension, it was a reminder that the system was perfectly content to keep paying the vulnerable as long as no one had to actually look at them. The families left behind have had to carry a unique type of grief, one where the memory of their loved ones is permanently intertwined with one of the most infamous crimes in modern history. Parents have had to live with the knowledge that their children's final hours were filled with a terror designed by a neighbor they used to say hello to on the street. The town of Snowtown itself became a victim. Its name turned into a punchline and a title for horror, despite the fact that the community had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. The old bank building became a dark tourist attraction until it was finally demolished, an attempt to scrub the physical stain of Bunting and Wagner from the earth. To expand upon the heartbreaking specifics of this case, we must also gaze into the lives of Suzanne Allen and Michael Gardner. Suzanne Allen was a woman who lived a deeply private, sometimes difficult life, navigating health issues and financial instability. When she crossed paths with Bunting, she thought she was finding a friend, someone who understood the rough edges of the Adelaide outer suburbs. Instead, her trust was weaponized against her. She was murdered, her remains hidden, and her very existence reduced to an automated income stream for Bunting, who continued to claim her benefits for years while telling anyone who asked that she had packed up and left. Michael Gardner was another soul crushed by this assembly line. He was a young man, only 19, who had entire decades ahead of him. He was targeted simply because Bunting viewed him as a weak link, a person whose lifestyle didn't fit his arbitrary, vicious standards of morality. Michael was tortured, his young life choked out, and his body placed into one of those heavy blue barrels, left to rot in the darkness of a vault, while his family frantically searched for him, holding on to the faint hope that he might walk through the front door again. The horror widened further to consume James Spyru, a man who was older, but no less vulnerable to the magnetic manipulation of Bunting's circle. James was a man who had known loneliness, and when Bunting offered a sense of belonging, James stepped into the circle willingly, completely unaware that he was walking into a slaughterhouse. His bank details were harvested, his autonomy stripped away, and his body dissolved into the toxic soup of the Snowtown vault. Then there was Gary O'Dwyer, a man whose life was quiet, isolated, and limited by a physical disability. Gary lived alone, a factor that made him the perfect target for a predator like Bunting, who looked at the isolated spaces of Adelaide like a farmer looking at a harvest. Gary was bound, beaten, electrocuted, and forced to record the mandatory cover story tape before his life was extinguished. His family was left with the torturous reality that Gary had died in absolute terror, calling out for help in a world that had effectively tuned out his frequency. The emotional destruction of this case is amplified by the fact that the killers were not ghosts lurking in dark alleys. They were inside the living rooms, sitting at the kitchen tables, and drinking beer on the front porches of their victims. They knew what made these people cry, they knew who they loved, and they used that intimate knowledge to trap them. When Robert Wagner stood in court, the true horror was his flat, monotone voice, a chilling echo of a man who had completely surrendered his mind to the absolute will of John Bunting. He spoke of the dismemberment, the cleaning of the knives, and the moving of the barrels as if he were describing a mundane day at a factory job. This complete absence of human feeling is what leaves a permanent scar on the history of Australia. It shows that under the right conditions of economic despair and psychological isolation, a normal human can be programmed to become a machine of pure, unadulterated malice. As the years continue to pass, the story of the bodies in the barrels remains a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked manipulation and the dark places the human mind can go when it is fed by hatred and a need for absolute control. John Bunting and Robert Wagner will grow old and die behind the concrete walls of their prison, stripped of the terrifying power they once wielded over the vulnerable. But the true act of justice is not their imprisonment. It is the act of remembering the 12 lives they tried to dissolve into nothingness. We must remember Clinton, Ray, Barry, Thomas, Elizabeth, David, Suzanne, Michael, James, Gary, and all the others, not for how they died in the dark of that vault, but for the humanity they possessed before the monsters found them. Their names must be spoken aloud, their memories must be honored, and their stories must serve as a shield to ensure that the shadows are never allowed to build a kingdom in our midst ever again. The legal fallout and the subsequent public inquiries highlighted massive flaws in the welfare monitoring systems of the time. It was revealed that for years, signatures were forged, addresses were shifted to post office boxes controlled by Bunting, and massive sums of money were withdrawn from the accounts of dead people, without a single red flag being raised by the banks or the government agencies. This bureaucratic blindness was the fuel that kept the operation running. If the money had stopped, the killings might have stopped, but the system ran on autopilot, unknowingly funding the very torture chambers that were destroying its citizens. The realization of this institutional neglect added a heavy layer of anger to the grief of the victims' families, who realized that their loved ones had been betrayed not just by the killers, but by the very state that was supposed to keep track of their well-being. The psychological profile of John Bunting continues to be taught in universities as a case study in destructive cult dynamics on a micro scale. He didn't need thousands of followers or a grand compound. He only needed 3 or 4 broken individuals who were willing to give up their morality in exchange for a sense of purpose. He built a microcosm of a fascist state in the living rooms of Salisbury North, where he was the supreme judge, the police force, and the executioner. His ability to twist the language of protection, claiming he was keeping the neighborhood children safe from pedophiles, shows the classic methodology of the psychopath, who always frames his highest cruelties as an act of public service. By the time his followers realized they were deep in a sea of blood, they were too compromised, too terrified of Bunting, and too legally guilty to ever turn back. Ultimately, the Snowtown tragedy is a story about the vital importance of connection. It tells us that when we allow sections of our cities to fall into deep economic despair, when we ignore the isolated, the disabled, and the mentally ill, we create a vacuum. And in that vacuum, monsters will always rise to fill the void. The light of justice found the barrels in 1999, but it arrived far too late for the 12 souls who had spent their final hours screaming into the concrete walls of a bank vault. Let their memory be a permanent call to look closer at our neighbors, to reach out to the lonely, and to ensure that no one is ever so invisible that their disappearance can be bought and sold for a welfare check. The bank is gone, the vault is dust, but the lesson of Snowtown remains an eternal boundary line in the dark geography of the human soul. There is a quiet, devastating frequency of silence that settles over a city when those in power decide that certain lives simply do not carry enough weight to be counted. In the sun-drenched, asphalt-heated sprawl of South Los Angeles during the mid-1980s, this silence became a license to kill. While the world's attention was captured by the glittering promise of Hollywood and the rising economic tide of the decade, a predator was moving through the shadows of the alleyways, carrying a small-caliber handgun and an absolute void where a conscience should have been. For over 20 years, he discarded the bodies of young black women in garbage bins, behind overgrown weeds, and beneath discarded mattresses, operating with a chilling confidence born from a terrible truth. He knew the police weren't looking for him because they had already written off his victims. They called him the Grim Sleeper because of an apparent 14-year gap in his murders. But the only thing truly sleeping was the justice system that allowed him to hunt in plain sight. This is the dark, continuous, and deeply emotional account of Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the man who turned systemic neglect into his personal camouflage, and the resilient community that refused to let the memory of his victims be erased. To understand how a monster could operate undetected for nearly a quarter of a century in one of the most heavily policed cities in the world, one must examine the socio-political climate of South Los Angeles in 1985. The neighborhood was in the grip of a devastating crack cocaine epidemic, a public health crisis that was treated by the state not with compassion or medical intervention, but with aggressive, militarized policing. The streets were flooded with cheap, highly addictive drugs, creating an underclass of vulnerable women who were struggling with addiction, poverty, and homelessness. To the institutional eyes of the Los Angeles Police Department, these women were not daughters, mothers, or sisters. They were categorized under a deeply offensive, informal designation known among officers as NHI, no human involved. If a woman struggling with addiction or sex work went missing or was found dead in an alley, the default assumption of the system was that she had simply fallen victim to her lifestyle. There was no outrage, no front-page news coverage, and no task force assigned to connect the dots. Lonnie Franklin Jr. did not have to hide his crimes in the deep wilderness or behind complex alibis. He simply had to choose his victims from the population society had already discarded. The tragedy began in the late summer of 1985 with a young woman named Deborah Jackson. Deborah was only 29 years old, a mother of two who had a warm laugh and a family that loved her deeply despite her personal struggles. On August 10, 1985, Deborah was shot in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun, and her body was left in an alleyway on West Gage Avenue. The responding officers processed the scene with a routine detachment, treating her death as just another tragic consequence of the street violence plague. There was no realization that this was the opening chapter of a decades-long slaughter. Just a year later, in August 1986, the killer struck again. Henrietta Wright was 34 years old, a mother of 5 who was known for her fiercely protective nature and her devotion to her children. Henrietta was shot twice in the chest and her body was discarded in an alley on West Vernon Avenue. Her family was left with a devastating void, her children growing up with the torturous mystery of who had taken their mother and why the police seemed so uninterested in finding the answer. The assembly line of death continued to gather momentum as the decade progressed. In January 1987, the body of 23-year-old Barbara Ware was found hidden under a discarded pile of garbage in an alley on East 138th Street. Barbara was a young woman with a gentle spirit whose family pleaded with detectives to take her death seriously. An anonymous caller had even phoned the police to report seeing a man in a blue and white station wagon dump her body, but the tip was filed away and never aggressively pursued. Just months later, in April 1987, Bernita Sparks, a vibrant 26-year-old who loved music and spent her time trying to help her friends navigate the tough streets of South LA, was found strangled and shot in a dumpster. In November of that same year, 26-year-old Mary Lowe was discovered in an alley on Western Avenue. Mary was a young woman who had a beautiful smile and dreams of building a stable life away from the chaos of the inner city. Her life was choked out by the same .25 caliber bullet, her body left in the cold dirt, as if she had never existed. The pattern was now terrifyingly clear to those who lived in the neighborhood, even if the police department refused to acknowledge it publicly. The women of South Los Angeles knew there was a predator among them, a man who offered rides, who seemed friendly and familiar, but who carried death in his passenger seat. In January 1988, LaCrika Jefferson, just 22 years old, was found shot in the face and chest in an alley on West 104th Street. A napkin had been placed over her face, a bizarre, dismissive gesture of mock respect from a killer who was beginning to feel entirely untouchable. By the time 18-year-old Alicia Alexander was found murdered in September 1988, the anger in the community was boiling over. Alicia was a beloved daughter, a young athlete who had her whole life ahead of her, whose father, Porter Alexander, would become one of the most vocal, tireless champions for justice in the decades to follow. Porter refused to let his daughter be classified as a statistic, standing on the very spots where the victims were found, demanding that the city look at the blood on its streets. The killer's run of absolute impunity was suddenly fractured on the night of November 20th, 1988, by a woman whose sheer will to live would eventually become his undoing. Enietra Washington was walking down the street when a man in a clean, orange Ford Pinto pulled up next to her and offered her a ride. He was polite, clean-cut, and spoke with a soft, unassuming voice. Sensing no immediate danger, Enietra accepted. But once she was inside the vehicle, the man's demeanor transformed from friendly neighbor to cold-blooded sadist. He shot her in the chest, pushing her back against the seat as the bullet tore through her lung. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, bleeding profusely, the man drove her to a secluded area, sexually assaulted her, and took a photograph of her bleeding, semi-conscious body with a Polaroid camera. Believing she was dead, he pushed her out of the moving car into the dirt of an alleyway. But Enietra was a survivor. She clawed her way back to her feet, dragging her bleeding body through the dark streets until she reached a hospital. Enietra Washington provided the police with a detailed description of her attacker, the orange Pinto, and even a composite sketch that was incredibly accurate. She described a quiet, polite man who worked in the neighborhood, someone who didn't look like a monster. Yet despite this massive breakthrough, the LAPD did not release the sketch to the public, nor did they warn the women of South Los Angeles that a serial killer was actively targeting them. The department feared that announcing a serial killer was on the loose would spark a panic or draw negative media attention to a city already struggling with its reputation. They chose public relations over public safety. For years, Enietra's testimony sat in a file, a roadmap to the killer that the police simply refused to drive. It was during this period that the killer earned his moniker, the Grim Sleeper. Following the attack on Enietra Washington, the trail of bodies matching the .25 caliber signature suddenly went cold. For 14 years, from 1988 to 2002, there were no officially recorded murders linked to the killer. The police assumed he had died, been incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or moved away, but the community knew better. They knew that a man who took such pleasure in the domination and destruction of women does not simply stop. The sleep was an illusion created by a fragmented database and a lack of investigative continuity. He hadn't stopped. He had simply adapted, continuing to live his quiet, respectable life as a backyard mechanic in South Los Angeles. A friendly neighbor who helped fix cars and took photos at block parties, while secretly keeping his dark trophies hidden in his garage. The nightmare awoke in the public consciousness once again in 2002, when the body of 14-year-old Princess Berthamio was found in an alley in Inglewood. Princess was a child, a runaway who was desperately vulnerable and searching for safety. Her young life was extinguished with the same cold detachment, her body discarded in the brush. In 2003, 35-year-old Valerie McCorvey was found strangled and shot in an alley on West 108th Street. Valerie was a mother who had tried multiple times to rebuild her life, whose family remembered her as a woman who loved to cook and take care of others. The final officially linked victim was Genesia Peters, found in January 2007 by a trash collector who noticed her body stuffed inside a garbage bag in an alley on Western Avenue. Genesia was 25 years old, a mother of one who was trying to navigate the difficult realities of her life. Her death was the catalyst that finally forced the LAPD to acknowledge the truth. The serial killer of the 1980s was still active, still hunting, and still living among them. The breakthrough that would finally bring the grim sleeper into the light did not come from traditional police work, but from a revolutionary leap in forensic science known as familial DNA searching. By 2008, a special task force called the 800-Degree Task Force had been formed to investigate the cold cases, but they had reached a dead end. They had the killer's DNA from the crime scenes, but it did not match any profile in the state's database of convicted offenders. In a desperate bid to crack the case, investigators utilized a controversial technique that allows the computer to search for partial matches in the database, looking for close relatives of the killer rather than the killer himself. In 2010, the search returned a hit. A young man named Christopher Franklin had been arrested on a weapons charge, and his DNA had been entered into the database. His profile was an incredibly close partial match to the DNA found on the bodies of the victims, indicating that the killer was likely his brother, his uncle, or his father. The detectives immediately mapped the family tree of Christopher Franklin. When they looked at his father, a 67-year-old retired sanitation worker and backyard mechanic named Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the pieces of the puzzle began to fall together with terrifying speed. Lonnie Franklin lived right in the heart of the killing zone, on West 81st Street. He drove a blue station wagon in the 1980s, matched the physical description provided by Enietra Washington 22 years prior, and had a history of minor arrests that kept him just under the radar of the felony DNA database. But to arrest a suspect of this magnitude, the police needed a direct, uncontaminated sample of his DNA to prove the match beyond a shadow of a doubt. They couldn't simply knock on his door and ask for a cheek swab. They had to get it without him ever knowing they were there. What followed was a high-stakes, undercover surveillance operation that played out in the mundane setting of a local pizza parlor. In July 2010, an undercover detective disguised himself as a waiter at a restaurant where Lonnie Franklin was attending a birthday party. The detective watched as Franklin ate his pizza, handled his napkin, and drank his soda. The moment Franklin walked out the door, leaving his plate behind, the detective rushed to the table. He carefully collected the half-eaten pizza crust, the discarded napkin, and the plastic cup, placing them into sterile evidence bags. The samples were rushed to the forensic laboratory for emergency processing. Within 24 hours, the results were in. The DNA on the pizza crust was an absolute perfect match to the DNA found on the bodies of the victims. The ghost of South Los Angeles finally had a face and an address. On July 7, 2010, police cruisers swarmed the quiet, modest home on West 81st Street. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested on his front lawn, offering no resistance and acting completely bewildered by the sudden appearance of the heavily armed officers. To his neighbors, his arrest was an absolute shock. This was Tito, the friendly neighborhood mechanic who fixed their cars for cheap, who lent them tools, and who was always willing to share a beer on his porch. He was viewed as a pillar of the block, a quiet, helpful older man who kept a tidy yard. They had no idea that for decades they had been living next to a slaughterhouse. When investigators crossed the threshold of Franklin's home to execute a search warrant, they were confronted with a secret gallery of horror that was almost impossible to comprehend. In his garage and behind the walls of his house, they found a hidden cache of photographs. Franklin had used a Polaroid and a digital camera to document his victims, keeping a library of over 180 distinct photos of women in various states of undress, unconsciousness, and death. Many of the women in the photos were smiling, suggesting they trusted him before the violence began. Others were slumped over, their eyes half closed, frozen in the moments of their violation. Among these photos, detectives found the picture of Enietra Washington, her chest still bleeding from the gunshot wound she had survived 22 years earlier. The police released these photos to the public in a desperate attempt to identify the women, a process that reopened decades of old wounds for families who suddenly saw the faces of their missing daughters and sisters on the evening news. The trial of Lonnie Franklin Jr. did not begin until 2016, delayed by years of legal maneuvering, defense motions, and the massive logistical challenge of processing the mountain of evidence. For the families of the victims, the delay was a secondary cruelty, a prolonged state of limbo that forced them to carry their grief in public. Porter Alexander, the father of 18-year-old Alicia, sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day, his eyes locked on the back of the man who had stolen his daughter's future. He wore a portrait of Alicia pinned to his lapel, ensuring that her presence was felt in the room. The prosecution presented an airtight, devastating case, playing the audio recordings of the anonymous tips, showing the forensic matching of the .25 caliber weapon, and introducing the terrifying testimony of Enietra Washington, who stood face to face with her attacker and named him as the man who had tried to end her life. Throughout the grueling trial, Lonnie Franklin sat at the defense table with a completely vacant, bored expression. He showed no remorse, no emotion, and no acknowledgement of the weeping families who filled the gallery. He was a vacuum of empathy, a man who had spent his entire life viewing women as nothing more than disposable property to be consumed and discarded. The defense tried to argue that the DNA evidence was contaminated, or that another, unnamed associate of Franklin's was the true killer, but the arguments were a fragile shield against the avalanche of scientific truth. On May 5, 2016, the jury returned its verdict. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was found guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The sentencing phase was a moment of profound, agonizing release for the families. One by one, mothers, fathers, and sisters stood at the podium to deliver their victim impact statements, addressing the killer directly. They spoke of the birthdays missed, the children raised without mothers, and the decades of silence they had been forced to endure because the city didn't care enough to look for their loved ones. Porter Alexander stood before the court and looked at Franklin, telling him that he had tried to erase his daughter, but instead, he had made her immortal in the pursuit of justice. The judge sentenced Franklin to death, a symbolic finality for a man who had spent his life delivering the same sentence to the innocent. Lonnie Franklin Jr. did not die on a gallows or in an execution chamber. On March 28, 2020, he was found unresponsive in his single cell at San Quentin State Prison, dying of natural causes at the age of 67. He died as a prisoner, stripped of his freedom, his power, and his respectability, while the memory of the women he killed continues to grow stronger. His death marked the closing of a legal chapter, but the true legacy of the Grim Sleeper case is not his punishment. It is the systemic failure that allowed him to exist in the first place. The story of the Grim Sleeper is a tragedy that belongs as much to the city of Los Angeles as it does to the killer himself. It is a reminder of the devastating consequences of institutional prejudice, a warning of what happens when we decide that some human lives are worth less than others. The victims of Lonnie Franklin were not no human involved. They were vibrant, complex individuals who were loved, who had dreams, and who deserved the full protection of the law. By telling their stories, by remembering their names, Deborah, Henrietta, Barbara, Bernita, Mary, Latrica, Alicia, Princess, Valerie, and Genesia. We push back against the silence that tried to swallow them. We must ensure that the streets of South Los Angeles are never that dark again, and that the light of justice reaches every corner of our communities, regardless of who lives there. To truly understand the scope of this failure, we must look at the work of the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders, a grassroots group of community activists, journalists, and residents who formed in the late 1980s. These were the people who did the work the police refused to do. They held rallies, they put up posters with the composite sketch of the killer, and they kept the names of the missing women alive in the public consciousness. They recognized that a predator was hunting their daughters, and they refused to accept the silence of the LAPD. Without their tireless advocacy, the files would have remained buried in the cold case archives, and Lonnie Franklin would have died a respected neighbor on West 81st Street. They are the true heroes of this narrative, the ones who stood as a shield for the vulnerable when the system turned its back. The emotional weight of the Grim Sleeper case is a lingering vibration in the neighborhoods of South Los Angeles. It is felt in the quiet alleyways where the flowers are still occasionally left, in the living rooms where the photos of young girls remain on the mantels, and in the hearts of the survivors who carry the physical and psychological scars of their encounters. Enietra Washington's survival was not just a miracle of biology, it was a monument to the resilience of the human spirit. She lived so that the others could be found. Her voice was the one that finally broke the silence, proving that the truth is a persistent thing that cannot be buried in an alleyway or a garbage bag. As we conclude this long and dark journey through the life and crimes of Lonnie Franklin Jr., let us hold on to the images of his victims before the violence found them. Let us remember their laughter, their creativity, and the love they shared with their families. They are the true center of this story, the light that finally found its way out of the shadows of systemic neglect. The Grim Sleeper is gone, a dark footnote in the history of crime, but the memory of his victims remains as an eternal call to action. We must look closer at the quiet spaces of our cities. We must value every single life with equal measure, and we must never allow the silence of indifference to become a hiding place for monsters again. The narrative of his crimes is a haunting journey into the deep-seated flaws of a society that often prioritizes certain lives over others. Each of the victims represents a story cut short, a family shattered, and a community left wondering how such darkness could breed in their backyard. To truly understand the impact of their actions, we have to look beyond the forensic details and see the individuals before they became names in a court file. We have to see the humanity that was crushed beneath Franklin's absolute need for dominance. The legal battle may be over, and the prisoner may have died in his cell, but the trail he left behind, the trail of music, of culture, and of love that was stolen from his victims, is still as vibrant as ever in the hearts of those who mourn them. Lonnie Franklin Jr. is a ghost of a dark time, but the truth he tried to bury in the alleys of South Los Angeles has taken the stand, and its voice will be heard forever. The deeper tragedy of the Grim Sleeper is the collective failure of observation. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of how invisible a human being can become if they are poor, addicted, or isolated. Franklin did not just kill bodies, he exploited social abandonment. He knew that if a young woman went missing, society would default to the assumption that she was just another casualty of the epidemic. He used our own apathy as his camouflage. Every time a body was found and classified as a low-priority investigation, it was a reminder that the system was perfectly content to let the vulnerable disappear as long as the rest of the city didn't have to look at them. The families left behind have had to carry a unique type of grief, one where the memory of their loved ones is permanently intertwined with one of the most infamous crimes in modern history. Parents have had to live with the knowledge that their children's final hours were filled with a terror designed by a neighbor they used to say hello to on the street. The community itself became a victim, its name turned into a punchline and a title for horror, despite the fact that the residents were the ones actively fighting to bring the killer to justice. The old houses and the quiet streets of West 81st Street still carry the memory of those years, a silent testament to the resilience of a neighborhood that refused to stay broken. As the years continue to pass, the story of the Grim Sleeper remains a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked manipulation and the dark places the human mind can go when it is fed by hatred and a need for absolute control. Lonnie Franklin Jr. is gone, but the true act of justice is not his imprisonment or his death. It is the act of remembering the lives he tried to dissolve into nothingness. We must remember Deborah, Henrietta, Barbara, Bernita, Mary, Lacrica, Alicia, Princess, Valerie, Genesia, and all the others, not for how they died in the dark of those alleys, but for the humanity they possessed before the monster found them. Their names must be spoken aloud, their memories must be honored, and their stories must serve as a shield to ensure that the shadows are never allowed to build a kingdom in our midst ever again. The investigative journey itself was a masterclass in the evolution of forensics, from the early days of basic ballistics to the revolutionary power of familial DNA. The case of the Grim Sleeper spans the history of modern crime solving. It was the progress of science that ultimately trapped him, a reminder that every step a killer takes leaves a footprint on history that will eventually be read. But science alone is not enough. It requires the human will to look at the evidence and to care about the outcome. It requires people who refuse to let the files go cold, and it requires families to keep the names of their loved ones alive. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it is buried, and when it does, it is louder than any gunshot and stronger than any killer's grip. Think of the silence that Lonnie Franklin Jr. relied on, the silence of the night, the silence of the alleys, and the silence of the system. He was a man of the quiet, a man who worked in the hush of a gunshot muffled by a blanket. But today that silence is gone. It has been replaced by the loud, clear voices of the women he tried to erase. Their names are being spoken in courtrooms, in newsrooms, and in the homes of their families. They are no longer the silent 10, they are the individuals who have finally been heard. And in their voices, we find the true conclusion to this story, a story that began in the dark alleys of South Los Angeles and ended in the light of the truth. As we conclude this long and dark journey, let us hold on to the images of his victims, not the photographs he kept in his garage, but the photos their families kept, the photos of them at graduations, at weddings, and at birthday parties. These are the real images of the victims. These are the faces of the people who were loved and who are now missed. Lonnie Franklin Jr. may have the title of the Grim Sleeper, but he does not have the final word. The final word belongs to the lives that were lived, the love that remains, and the justice that, however late, finally arrived. The streets are still there, the houses are still standing, but the monster is gone, and in his place, we must remain vigilant, ensuring that the light never fails to reach the shadows again. The story of the Grim Sleeper is a long, winding road through the heart of American darkness. It is a story of missed chances, systemic failure, and the ultimate triumph of persistence. It is a story that should make us uncomfortable, for in that discomfort, we find the motivation to change. We cannot bring back the lives that were taken, but we can honor them by building a world where their disappearances would be noticed immediately, where their lives would be valued equally, and where their killer would be caught before the first body was even cold. That is the only true way to answer the horror of Lonnie Franklin Jr. That is the only way to turn the Tenebris into dawn. The weight of this narrative is heavy, as it should be. To tell the story of these murders is to carry the weight of worlds that were destroyed. But as we put this story to rest, we must also acknowledge the strength of the human spirit, the strength of the investigators who never gave up, the strength of the families who endured decades of silence, and even the strength of the victims in their final moments. They fought for their lives, and though they lost that battle, they have won the war for their identities. They are home now, they are known, and they will never be forgotten again. Finality came for Lonnie Franklin Jr. in a prison cell, a quiet end for a man who had caused so much noise in the lives of others. He died with no one to mourn him, a stark contrast to the women he left behind who are still remembered with grief and love. His death marks the closing of a chapter, but the book of his crimes will remain open for as long as it takes to find every name. We owe it to the victims, we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the future. Let the memory of the Grim Sleeper be a shadow that teaches us to value the light. Let his victims be the stars that guide us toward a more just and compassionate world. Every mile he drove in that orange Pinto was a mile toward his own eventual capture, even if it took 22 years. Every photo he took was a fingerprint on history that would eventually be read. He thought he was moving through a world that didn't care, but he was wrong. The world does care, even if it takes a long time to show it. The truth is a persistent thing. It doesn't mind waiting in the evidence lockers, in the cold case files, and in the DNA of a discarded pizza crust. And when the truth finally arrived, it was stronger than any killer's grip. As the final words of this script are spoken, think of the vast landscape of South Los Angeles. Think of the streets stretching out toward the horizon, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and the quiet places in between. It is a community of deep strength, of history, and of love. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was a shadow that stretched across that land for a quarter of a century. But today, the sun is up, the names are known, the victims are honored, and the monster is gone. Let us walk in the light, and let us never forget the lessons of the alleyways. Let us never forget the women of the grim sleeper. Let us never forget. When you call the police to report a murder, you expect the person who answers to be your lifeline. You expect them to hunt down the monster responsible. But what happens when the monster is the person answering the call? In 1986, a young, vibrant nurse named Sherri Rasmussen was brutally beaten and shot to death inside her Los Angeles condominium. For more than 2 decades, the case sat frozen, dismissed by detectives as a burglary gone wrong. The real killer wasn't a desperate street thief. She was a highly respected, rising star within the very police department investigating the crime. This is a story of fatal obsession, institutional blindness, and the silent forensic time bomb that waited 23 years to explode. This is the ultimate continuous account of the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The tragedy of Sherri Rasmussen is rooted in the toxic soil of a love triangle that one person simply refused to let go. Sherri was a woman who seemed to have everything ahead of her. At just 29 years old, she was a highly accomplished critical care nursing supervisor at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She was brilliant, deeply compassionate, and the emotional anchor of a close-knit family. In 1984, she met John Rutan, a young, handsome engineer. The chemistry between them was immediate and profound, culminating in a beautiful wedding in November 1985. They were newlyweds, deeply in love, and beginning their lives together in a quiet, gated condominium complex in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles. But lingering in the background of their happiness was a shadow from John's past, a shadow that wore a badge. Years before meeting Sherri, during his college days, John had been involved in an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. While John viewed the relationship as a casual, non-binding companionship, Stephanie viewed it with an intensity that bordered on pathology. She was profoundly, obsessively in love with him. Shortly after college, Stephanie joined the Los Angeles Police Department, channeling her tenacity and competitive drive into a career as a street cop. But her professional focus did nothing to temper her personal fixation. When John threw a surprise party for his own birthday, Stephanie attended, only to be devastated by the realization that John was moving on and dating other women. Her diary entries from 1985 paint a portrait of a woman spiraling into deep depression and acute jealousy. When she learned of John and Sherri's engagement, she wrote that her concentration was entirely destroyed, weeping openly to her roommate. Stephanie could not accept that she had been replaced. Her jealousy soon manifested as active harassment. On one occasion, on a day off from duty, Stephanie walked directly into the hospital where Sherri worked. Dressed provocatively, she confronted the young nurse in her own office. Stephanie bluntly informed Sherri that things were not over between her and John, boldly claiming that when the marriage inevitably failed, she would be there to pick up the pieces. When Sherri told her that her services would not be needed, Stephanie delivered a chilling, prophetic ultimatum. "If I can't have John, no one else will, including you." Sherri was deeply shaken. She confronted John that evening, and though John tried to downplay the incident as the behavior of a harmless, eccentric ex-girlfriend, Sherri's anxiety only grew. The couple began receiving mysterious hang-up phone calls at their home, prompting them to install a burglar alarm system just before their honeymoon. Sherri felt a persistent, creeping dread, telling her father Nels Rasmussen, that John's ex-girlfriend, the LAPD cop, was stalking her. The dread became a horrific reality on the morning of February 24, 1986. John Rutan left the condominium early for work, leaving Sherri behind, who had decided to stay home from her nursing shift to nurse a minor ailment. It was the last time he would see his wife alive. Sometime during those morning hours, an intruder entered the home. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting that Sherri either opened the door to someone she recognized, or the attacker possessed a key or found an unlocked point of entry. What followed inside the walls of that living room was a violent, desperate, and extended struggle for survival. Sherri Rasmussen did not go down easily. She fought with everything she had, leaving blood splattered across the walls, a broken vase shattered near her head, and her own fingernails broken off near the front door as she clawed at her assailant. The attacker, fueled by an unnatural rage, bludgeoned Sherri repeatedly about the face and head, using the heavy muzzle of a handgun to break the young nurse's spirit. During the violent melee, the assailant did something uniquely savage. They sank their teeth deep into Sherri's left inner forearm, biting down with enough force to cause severe internal hemorrhaging. Finally, to end the struggle, the killer grabbed a thick, quilted blanket from the house, wrapped it tightly around the barrel of the gun to muffle the sound of the discharge, and pressed it against Sherri's chest. 3 shots were fired. The bullets tore through the blanket and into Sherri's torso, killing her instantly. The killer then staged the scene, pulling electronic stereo equipment out of a cabinet and stacking it neatly by the door to make it look like a burglary that had been interrupted. They took Sherri's silver BMW, drove it away from the scene, and abandoned it a few miles away, leaving the young newlyweds' home a blood-soaked tomb. When John Rutan returned home that evening, his heart sank. He noticed broken glass on the driveway from a shattered patio door and found the garage door ajar. Stepping into the living room, he was met with a scene of absolute devastation. His bride was lying dead on the floor, still wearing her sleep shirt and robe, surrounded by the ruins of their short-lived happiness. The LAPD arrived on the scene, but almost immediately the investigation fell victim to a fatal flaw: tunnel vision. The lead detective saw the stacked stereo equipment and the missing car and instantly concluded that Sherri had surprised 2 male burglars who panicked, killed her, and fled. It was a neat, convenient theory that fit the narrative of rising street crime in 1980s Los Angeles, but it completely ignored the glaring anomalies of the crime scene. Burglars rarely engage in prolonged face-to-face physical combat with a resident when an escape route is available. They rarely bite their victims, and they certainly do not take the time to find a blanket to muffle their gunshots. From day one, Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, pleaded with detectives to look into John's ex-girlfriend, the LAPD officer. He told them about the stalking, the confrontation at the hospital, and the explicit threats Stephanie Lazarus had made. But his pleas were met with cold indifference, dismissal, and defensive posturing. The lead detective went so far as to tell Nels that he watched too much television, insisting that a fellow police officer could not possibly be involved. The department's protective instinct for its own, combined with a lazy adherence to the burglary theory, created an impenetrable shield around Stephanie. Even when Stephanie reported her own personal backup weapon, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, stolen just 2 weeks after the murder, no one connected the dots. The bullets pulled from Sherri's body were federal .38 caliber rounds, the exact ammunition standard issued to and required for LAPD officers at the time. Yet the file was closed, the leads dried up, and the murder of Sherri Rasmussen officially went cold, leaving a grieving family to suffer in silence for over 2 decades. While Sherri lay in a cemetery, Stephanie Lazarus's life and career flourished. She rose through the ranks of the LAPD, earning commendations, respect, and promotions. She eventually became a highly regarded detective within the elite robbery homicide division, ironically tasked with solving art forgeries and high-profile thefts. She married a fellow LAPD detective, adopted a child, and lived a comfortable suburban life. She had completely escaped her past, operating under the assumption that the passage of time had eroded any chance of her ever being caught. She forgot that a criminalist named Lloyd Mahaney had taken a vital piece of evidence from the crime scene in 1986, a cotton swab of the saliva left behind inside the deep bite mark on Sherri's arm. That swab was placed into a plastic tube, sealed in an evidence envelope, and tucked away in a dark corner of the LAPD property division, waiting for the future to arrive. The future finally arrived in 2004. A routine audit of cold case files brought Sherri's murder back to the desk of criminalist Jennifer Francis. Using advanced forensic techniques that were science fiction in 1986, Francis examined the long-forgotten bite mark swab under a microscope and detected nucleated epithelial cells from human saliva. She successfully extracted a full DNA profile. When the results came back, they sent a shockwave through the laboratory. The DNA belonged to a female. This single scientific fact shattered 20 years of LAPD dogma. The theory of two male burglars was instantly dead. Sherri's killer was a woman. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders, but no match was found. The killer was someone without a criminal record, someone who had managed to stay entirely clean. The file languished for a few more years until 2009, when a team of Van Nuys homicide detectives took a fresh, unbiased look at the cold case. They bypassed the old burglary narrative entirely and focused strictly on the women who had a motive to want Sherri Rasmussen dead. They began checking the backgrounds of everyone mentioned in the original notes. They systematically eliminated other former girlfriends and acquaintances through voluntary DNA testing. Eventually, only one name remained on their ledger: Stephanie Lazarus. The detectives were paralyzed by the horrifying realization that their prime suspect was currently sitting just a few floors above them in the very same building, working as an active duty detective. They knew that if Stephanie got even a whisper of the investigation, she could use her extensive police training and institutional access to destroy evidence or flee. The investigation transformed into a covert, high-stakes espionage operation within the walls of the LAPD. A specialized team of undercover officers was assigned to shadow Detective Lazarus outside of work. They followed her as she ran errands, waiting patiently for her to leave behind a biological footprint. The moment came at a local Costco. Stephanie finished a soda, discarded the plastic cup and straw into a trash can, and walked away. The undercover team immediately retrieved the cup. The straw was rushed to the forensic lab, where scientists carefully extracted the DNA from her saliva and compared it to the 23-year-old sample taken from Sherri's arm. It was a perfect, undeniable match. The statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Stephanie Lazarus was 1 in many billions. The monster had finally been unmasked, caught by her own bite. On the morning of June 5, 2009, the trap was sprung with surgical precision. 2 robbery-homicide detectives approached Stephanie at her desk, casually asking her to accompany them down to an interview room in the basement. They claimed they needed her expertise on an unrelated case involving an art theft suspect she had previously investigated. Stephanie, completely unsuspecting, left her firearm at her desk, as required when entering the secure jail facility, and walked willingly into the trap. What followed is one of the most famous recorded interrogations in criminal history. For over an hour, the detectives engaged in a psychological chess match. They started with casual small talk, asking about her career and her history with the department. Slowly, deliberately, they shifted the conversation to her college years, asking if she remembered an old boyfriend named John Rutan. The shift in the room's energy was palpable. The video footage shows Stephanie's demeanor instantly hardening. Cooperative facade began to chip away, replaced by a defensive, anxious stutter. She claimed she barely remembered John, downplaying their years of history as just a casual acquaintance from decades ago. When the detectives gently pressed further, asking if she had ever met John's wife Sherri, or if she remembered hearing about her tragic murder, Stephanie's defense mechanisms went into overdrive. She repeatedly stated that the events were too long ago, that her memory was foggy, and that she didn't understand why she was being questioned about a 20-year-old case. When the detectives finally dropped the hammer, informing her that they had definitive DNA evidence linking her to the murder scene, Stephanie realized she had been cornered. She stood up, refused to cooperate further, and attempted to walk out of the room. But she wasn't going back to her desk. She was placed under arrest, handcuffed, and charged with first-degree capital murder. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus in 2012 was a global media sensation, exposing the dark underbelly of a legendary police department and forcing a public reckoning with institutional negligence. The prosecution built a brilliant, airtight, circumstantial case. They introduced Stephanie's personal diaries, which explicitly documented her broken heart, her volatile jealousy, and her dangerous obsession with John Ruetten. They called John to the stand, who wept as he testified about his past with Stephanie and the overwhelming guilt he carried for downplaying the harassment his late wife had suffered before her death. The defense team fought aggressively, attempting to discredit the forensic handling of the bite mark sample, pointing to a small hole in the evidence envelope and suggesting the DNA had been contaminated or cross-contaminated over the 23 years in storage. But the jury saw through the technical obfuscation. The science was absolute. After a multi-week trial, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, traded her detective shield for a blue inmate jumpsuit, and was sent away to a maximum security facility. The profound tragedy of this case lies not only in the brutal taking of a young life, but in the devastating reality of what could have been. For 23 years, a grieving family had to live with the agonizing belief that their daughter's killer was walking free, while the actual killer was collecting a paycheck from the state, rising through the ranks of the law, and hiding behind the very system designed to protect the innocent. In a stunning turn of events during a parole hearing, Stephanie Lazarus finally confessed to the crime, admitting to the panel that she had allowed her jealousy to override her humanity. While she was initially recommended for parole, the full board rescinded the decision after an emotional outcry from Sherri's surviving sisters and widower, who described her as a conniving, dangerous criminal who used her police training to commit the ultimate betrayal. To fully understand the length and depth of the pain this case inflicted, one must examine the systematic failure that went beyond simple tunnel vision. The Los Angeles Police Department of the 1980s was an institution defined by an insular protective culture. When a high-ranking detective or even a standard beat cop was accused of something by a civilian, the default setting of the department was to circle the wagons. Nels Rasmussen didn't just mention Stephanie Lazarus once. He wrote letters, he made phone calls, and he practically begged the department to look at the woman who had openly threatened his daughter at her place of work. The note containing Lazarus's name was placed in the file, but it was buried so deeply under the paperwork of the interrupted burglary theory that it was effectively erased. The arrogance of the original investigators allowed a murderer to walk among them, sharing their break rooms and locker facilities, completely insulated from the law she had sworn to uphold. This institutional blindness left the Rasmussen family isolated in their grief. For 23 years, every holiday, every anniversary of Sherri's death was poisoned by the knowledge that the justice system had completely abandoned them. Nels Rasmussen spent a fortune hiring private investigators, trying to keep the case alive, while Stephanie Lazarus was buying a home, advancing her career, and building her own family. The stark contrast between the two realities is what makes this case a multi-layered tragedy. One family's life was permanently frozen in a state of unresolvable trauma, while the person responsible for that trauma was being praised by the city of Los Angeles for her detective work. Lazarus even became an expert in tracking down stolen art, utilizing the very investigative skills she used to cover up her own capital crime to solve the property crimes of the wealthy. The psychological profile of Stephanie Lazarus is an exploration of a narcissism so profound that it was able to survive decades without cracking. In her own mind, she was the victim. Her diaries from the period reveal a woman who felt entitled to John Ruetten's affection, viewing Sherri Rasmussen as an obstacle to be cleared away, rather than a human being with a right to exist. The savage nature of the crime, the bludgeoning, the bite mark, the execution-style shots through a blanket, points to a crime of pure, unfiltered rage. It was an eviction of a rival. Yet hours after committing this act of absolute brutality, Lazarus put on her uniform, adjusted her badge, and went to work, blending seamlessly back into the routine of a dedicated public servant. This ability to completely compartmentalize such violence is a defining trait of the most dangerous psychopathic minds. The role of John Ruetten in this tragedy is also one of immense, lifelong burden. Ruetten was caught in the middle of an obsession he never asked for and never truly understood until it was far too late. His decision to stay in contact with Lazarus after his college days, and even his brief interactions with her after the murder, became a source of intense scrutiny during the trial. The defense tried to use his past relationship with Lazarus to muddy the waters, suggesting that the investigation was a witch hunt driven by a family's desperation rather than forensic truth. Ruetten had to sit on the witness stand and admit to the world that his own failure to recognize the depths of Lazarus's obsession had inadvertently put his wife in the line of fire. The guilt he carried was a public spectacle, a heavy price to pay for a casual relationship from his youth. The forensic journey of the bite mark sample is a testament to the quiet preservation of truth. When Lloyd Mahaney swabbed that wound in 1986, DNA profiling was in its infancy, a theoretical tool used by a handful of scientists in Europe. He had no idea that the moisture he was collecting on a piece of cotton would become the ultimate arbiter of justice decades later. The fact that the sample survived the chaotic storage systems of the LAPD through the late 80s and 90s, a period marked by the riots, the O.J. Simpson trial, and massive corruption scandals, is nothing short of a miracle. The evidence envelope sat in a cold room, outlasting the careers of the original detectives, outlasting the rise and fall of political regimes within the city, just waiting for the technology to catch up to the crime. When Jennifer Francis finally ran the sample in 2004, she wasn't looking for a cop. She was just looking for a name. The discovery that the DNA profile belonged to a female was the first crack in the wall of protection that had surrounded Lazarus for a generation. It forced the new generation of detectives to look back at the old notes with a completely open mind. They had to ask themselves the hard questions that their predecessors had dismissed. Why did the original team ignore the stalker? Why didn't anyone check the ammunition requirements? The realization that the killer was one of their own was a bitter pill for the Van Nuys homicide team, but to their credit, they didn't bury the truth. They treated Detective Lazarus with the same clinical, relentless focus they would apply to any gang member or street predator. The surveillance of Lazarus in 2009 was a masterpiece of internal security. The detectives knew that if she suspected anything, her status as a veteran investigator would give her an immediate advantage. She knew how wiretaps worked, she knew how to spot a tail, and she had access to the very systems they were using to track her. Every move had to be calculated to look like routine department business. When they followed her to Costco, it was a game of inches. The undercover officer who retrieved the discarded cup had to do so without drawing the attention of the store security or Lazarus herself, knowing that a single mistake would blow the entire operation wide open. The tension in the forensic lab as they waited for the results of the straw analysis was suffocating. They knew they were about to arrest a sitting detective inside a police precinct. The interrogation video remains a chilling piece of criminal history because of what is not said. For the first 45 minutes, the atmosphere in the room is almost collegial. They talk about retirement plans, about mutual acquaintances in the department, and about the stresses of the job. Shifts comfortably in her chair and acts like a mentor helping out younger detectives. But as the names John Ruetten and Sherri Rasmussen are introduced, the physical transformation of Lazarus is mesmerizing. Her shoulders drop, her voice rises in pitch, and she begins a frantic, defensive dance of denial. She tries to use her rank as a shield, questioning why they are wasting her time with ancient history. The moment she realizes that they aren't asking for her help, but are actually locking her in, the mask falls completely. The entitlement returns, and she demands to know who authorized this interview, unaware that her entire career had just vanished into a forensic matching profile. The trial was not just a judgment of Stephanie Lazarus, it was an exposure of the systemic biases of an entire era. The defense spent weeks trying to prove that the evidence had been tampered with, suggesting a grand conspiracy within the lab to frame a respected detective to clear a cold case. They brought in experts to argue that the DNA on the swab could have come from a technician's sneeze or a contaminated tube. But the prosecution counteracted every argument with the absolute certainty of statistics. The match was too clean, the diaries were too precise, and the bullet fragments were too consistent. The jury took only a few days to reach a unanimous verdict of guilty. a moment that Nels Rasmussen had waited nearly 10,000 days to see. The final chapter of the Stephanie Lazarus story is still being written in the cells of the California prison system. Her recent admission of guilt during the parole process, while a moment of legal utility, offered little comfort to the Rasmussen family. They see it for what it is, a tactical surrender by a master manipulator who finally realized that her badge could no longer protect her from the consequences of her actions. The board's decision to keep her behind bars into the late 2020s is a reflection of the enduring severity of her crime. She didn't just take a life, she polluted the stream of justice, utilizing the trust of the public as a cloak for murder. As the years continued to accumulate since that bloody morning in Van Nuys, the memory of Sherri Rasmussen has finally been separated from the shadow of her killer. She is remembered now for the brilliant, compassionate person she was, a nurse who dedicated her life to saving others, a daughter who was the light of her parents' lives, and a young bride whose future was stolen by a toxic obsession. The continuous road of this case proves that no matter how powerful the institution, no matter how thick the blue wall, the truth possesses a weight that can eventually crush any cover-up. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was a silent scream for justice, and 23 years later, the world finally listened. The case is closed, the detective is a prisoner, and the light has finally returned to the memory of Sherri Rasmussen. Imagine a man who was a pillar of his community, an Eagle Scout, a grandfather, and a businessman who seemed to have mastered the dawn of the digital age. He was the kind of person you'd trust with your career, your secrets, and your future. But while he was typing welcome to strangers in the first chat rooms of the internet, he was preparing a graveyard on a quiet Kansas farm. He didn't just steal lives, he stole identities, replacing vibrant women with a trail of forged letters and empty promises. He is known as the world's first internet serial killer, but to the families who waited decades for the truth, he is the man who turned the World Wide Web into a digital web of death. This is the harrowing deep dive into the double life of John Edward Robinson, the predator who hid behind a keyboard, and the women who deserved so much more than to become a footnote in his dark legacy. To truly understand how a monster could operate in plain sight for so long, we have to go back to a time before the screens lit up. John Edward Robinson did not suddenly become a predator in the digital age. He was a lifelong con artist, a man who viewed human beings not as people with feelings, hopes, and dreams, but as assets to be manipulated and discarded. Born in the 1940s in Cicero, Illinois, Robinson was a child who learned early on that appearance was everything. He achieved the rank of Eagle Scout, a badge of honor that would later serve as a powerful shield against suspicion. He presented himself as an upstanding, moral young man, but beneath that polished veneer, a parasitic nature was already taking hold. In the early 1960s, Robinson was a student of discipline. He attended a preparatory seminary for 2 years, considering the priesthood. This is where he likely refined his ability to project an aura of moral superiority. But the calling wasn't spiritual, it was theatrical. By the late 1960s, Robinson had moved into white-collar crime. He became a master of the ledger, a man who realized that if you dress in an expensive suit and speak with quiet authority, people will hand you their money and their trust. In 1966, he found work as an X-ray technician at a medical practice in Kansas City. Within 6 months, he had drained the practice's bank account. He was a fraud, using forged credentials to secure the job in the first place. This would become his signature move. He would create a shell company, print up official-looking letterhead, and invent a persona that projected wealth and success. When he was caught embezzling over $30,000 from that medical practice, he was sentenced to probation. But for Robinson, a criminal record wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. He simply moved his family to Chicago, violating his probation, and started a new round of scams. He was a paper monster, existing in the margins of society. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Robinson was a ghost in the financial system. He was arrested for stealing thousands of dollars worth of stamps from an employer, convicted of check forgery, and sent to jail for stealing a $6,000 check. Every time he was released, he returned to the same pattern. He formed bogus companies with names like EquiPlus and Equi2, presenting them as high-powered management consulting firms. He was a man who lived a profound double life. To his neighbors in Olathe, Kansas, where he eventually settled with his wife Nancy and their children, he was a successful, slightly eccentric entrepreneur. He was the grandfatherly figure who loved to talk about his business ventures. But to the women who responded to his employment ads, he was a predator who was about to lead them into a waking nightmare. The first name that must be etched into our memory is Paula Guilan Godfrey. In 1984, Paula was only 19 years old, a young woman living in Overland Park, Kansas. She was at the very beginning of her life, a bright girl who was eager to build a career in the business world. She was full of ambition, looking for an entry-level position that would allow her to learn and grow. That was when she saw an advertisement for Robinson's firm, Equi2. Robinson presented himself as a seasoned mentor who could help a young woman find her footing in a competitive world. He offered her a job as a sales representative. Paula was thrilled. She told her family that Robinson had arranged a fantastic opportunity for her. He claimed that he was sending a group of young women to San Antonio, Texas, to enroll in a specialized course to sharpen their clerical and business skills. On September 1st, 1984, Robinson pulled up to the Godfrey residence. He was polite, professional, and entirely reassuring to Paula's parents. He took her luggage, opened the door for her, and drove her away ostensibly to the airport for her flight to a bright future. Paula Godfrey was never seen again, but the cruelty of John Robinson didn't end with her disappearance. Shortly after she vanished, a letter arrived at the Godfrey home. It was typed on a typewriter, and it bore Paula's signature. The letter claimed that she was doing well in her new life, that she had decided to move on, and that she didn't want her family to try to find her. For years, her mother, Lenora Godfrey, lived in a state of suspended animation. She kept Paula's bedroom exactly as the 19-year-old had left it. She kept the bed made, the posters on the wall, and the clothes hanging in the closet, waiting for the day her daughter would walk back through the door. Lenora spent decades looking at every blonde-haired girl on the street, wondering if it was her Paula. She didn't know that the typed letter was a forgery, a calculated piece of psychological warfare designed to keep the family from calling the police. Robinson didn't just steal Paula's life, he stole her family's ability to grieve, leaving them in an agonizing limbo that would last for 16 years. By 1985, Robinson's methods had become even more predatory. He began actively seeking out women who were at their most vulnerable, women who were desperate for a helping hand. That was when he met Lisa Stasi. Lisa was just 19 years old, a single mother living at Hope House, a shelter for homeless and battered women in Kansas City. She was struggling to provide for her 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. Lisa was tired, she was scared, and she was looking for any lifeline that would help her build a stable life for her baby. Robinson approached her using the alias John Osborne. He told Lisa that he was a representative of the Kansas City Outreach Program, a charitable organization designed to assist young mothers in need. He painted a picture of a wonderful future. He promised her free room and board, a job, and help studying for her GED, all in exchange for a fresh start in Chicago. To a young mother with nothing, it sounded like a miracle. Lisa trusted him. She gathered up her baby, packed what few belongings she had, and checked into a local Roadway Inn where Robinson had arranged a room. Before she left, Robinson did something chillingly calculating. He asked her to sign several sheets of blank stationery, claiming it was for official paperwork and tax forms. On January 10th, 1985, Lisa made a final, frantic phone call to her mother-in-law. She sounded frightened. She said that some people were telling her she wasn't a fit mother and that she needed to give up her baby. The last words her mother-in-law heard before the line went dead were, "Here they come." Lisa Stasi was never seen again. Her body has never been found to this day. But the story of her 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany, took a turn that is almost impossible to believe. Robinson's brother Donald and his wife Helen had been trying desperately to adopt a child for years. On that very same day in January, Robinson called his brother in Chicago and told him that he had found a baby girl for them. He claimed that a young mother had committed suicide in a hotel room and had abandoned the child. Robinson provided his brother with a stack of forged adoption papers, even charging him over $5,000 in fake legal fees. For 15 years, that little baby grew up in Chicago as Heather Robinson. She called the killer Uncle John. She sat across the table from him at Thanksgiving dinners, completely unaware that the man passing her the turkey was the man who had murdered her biological mother and erased her identity. In 1987, Robinson struck again, targeting another young woman who was simply trying to find a better path for herself. Catherine Frances Clampett was 27 years old, a mother from Texas who had recently moved to the Kansas City area to live with her brother's family and seek employment. Catherine was a woman of intelligence and spirit, but like so many others, she was drawn in by the promises of a smooth-talking con man. She saw an advertisement for Robinson's firm, Equi2. The ad promised a high-paying position with opportunities for extensive travel and even a brand-new corporate wardrobe. Catherine was hired, and for a short time she believed her life was finally turning around. She began staying at local hotels near the Equi2 offices, preparing for what she thought was a career of jet-setting and professional success. On June 15, 1987, Catherine left her hotel to attend a business meeting with Robinson. She walked out into the warm June air and vanished into the ether. Like Paula and Lisa before her, Catherine was gone without a trace. Her family in Texas was left to wonder why a woman who loved her child would suddenly stop calling. They were left with a silence that was heavy with dread. Robinson had once again used a woman's desire for a better life as the bait to lure her to her death. Following Catherine's disappearance, Robinson's activities were temporarily paused by a force he couldn't manipulate: the law. Between 1987 and 1993, he was incarcerated, first in Kansas on multiple fraud convictions, and later in Missouri for parole violations. For 6 years, the women of the Midwest were safe from his reach. But inside the walls of the prison, Robinson wasn't rehabilitating. He was observing. He was watching the world change. He was watching as a new technology began to take hold of the American consciousness. When John Edward Robinson was released from prison in 1993, the world was a different place. The internet was no longer just a tool for scientists and academics. It was becoming a public square. People were buying home computers, logging onto dial-up connections, and entering chat rooms. To a master manipulator like Robinson, this was the ultimate gift. The internet offered the perfect mask. On a glowing screen, you didn't have to forge a letterhead or rent a fake office. You could be anyone you wanted to be with a few keystrokes. You could build a persona of wealth, power, and authority without ever having to show your face. Robinson embraced the digital world with a terrifying enthusiasm. He began frequenting chat rooms dedicated to BDSM, bondage, discipline, dominance, and submission. Under the handle Slave Master, he began to craft a digital empire of control. He wasn't looking for a community of consenting adults. He was looking for a way to formalize his deep-seated need for absolute ownership over another human being. He presented himself to women in these chat rooms as a wealthy, sophisticated master who had a large estate, a staff of servants, and the financial means to take care of the submissive partner completely. To the outside world, Robinson was still the harmless, slightly eccentric grandfather living in a comfortable home in Olathe. His wife Nancy and his children claim they had no idea what he was doing on the computer late at night. But behind closed doors, in the dark glow of the monitor, Robinson was weaving a web that would reach across state lines and even across the Atlantic Ocean. He began searching for women who were interested in the BDSM lifestyle, women who were willing to sign contracts that handed over control of their lives to a dominant partner. He used their desires and their trust as a direct path to their destruction. The first woman known to have been lured by the digital slave master was Isabel Lewicka. Isabel was only 21 years old, a student who had immigrated to the United States from Poland. She was an artist, a young woman with a bright, creative mind and a deep curiosity about the world. She met Robinson online in 1997. Robinson painted a picture of a life filled with luxury and security. He told her that if she moved to Kansas to be with him, he would take care of her, support her art, and provide her with a stable home. Isabel, thousands of miles from her home country and looking for a sense of belonging, agreed. She signed a contract with him and moved to Kansas. For a time, she was seen living in a trailer on Robinson's property. Witnesses later recalled that she looked thin, frightened, and profoundly isolated. She was a young woman in a foreign country, trapped in a psychological cage created by a master manipulator. Robinson even gave her an engagement ring, despite the fact that he was still married and living with his wife. He brought her to the county registrar to pay for a marriage license, a document that was never picked up. By 1999, Isabel Lewicka had fallen completely silent. Her family in Poland, who had held such high hopes for her life in America, were left with the agonizing reality that their beautiful artist daughter had simply vanished into the vast American Midwest. While Isabel was living in that trailer, Robinson was already spinning his web for his next victim, Beverly Bonner. Beverly was 49 years old, a woman of quiet dignity and intelligence. She had spent years working as a prison librarian, a woman who loved books and the quiet sanctuary of the written word. In 1993, she was going through a divorce, a time of profound emotional upheaval and vulnerability. She met Robinson, and he presented himself as the partner she had been waiting for. He promised her a fresh start, telling her that they were going to move to Chicago and start a new life together. Beverly packed her bags, said goodbye to her life in Missouri, and stepped into Robinson's world. Her family never heard her voice again. But just like with Paula Godfrey and Sheila Faith, the paper trail continued. Robinson arranged for Beverly's alimony checks to be forwarded to a post office box in Kansas. For years, Beverly's elderly mother continued to forward the checks, believing her daughter was alive and traveling with her new partner. Robinson cashed those checks for years, profiting from the death of a woman who had simply wanted a second chance at happiness. But the most heartbreaking chapter of Robinson's 1990s spree involves a mother and daughter whose story is a testament to both the depth of human depravity and the enduring power of maternal love. Sheila Faith was a widow living in Colorado. She was a woman who had faced immense struggles in her life, but her entire universe revolved around her 15-year-old daughter, Debbie. Debbie had cerebral palsy. She used a wheelchair and required constant, dedicated care. They were a team, a mother and daughter who were inseparable. Sheila's primary goal in life was to ensure that Debbie had the best care possible and a safe environment in which to grow. Robinson discovered Sheila online in 1994. He presented himself as a wealthy benefactor who wanted to help. He told Sheila that he had access to a specialized school in Kansas that would be perfect for Debbie, and he offered Sheila a job at one of his companies. To a mother struggling to provide for a disabled child, it sounded like a dream come true. Sheila packed up their belongings, put Debbie in the car, and drove to Kansas. They were never seen alive again. But Robinson didn't just discard them. For 15 years, he continued to collect Sheila's Social Security checks and Debbie's disability benefits. He didn't just take their lives, he used their existence as a source of steady income. He hid their bodies in 85-gallon chemical drums and placed them in a storage unit he had rented in Raymore, Missouri. For over a decade, while people walked past those storage units to retrieve their lawnmowers and holiday decorations, the remains of a mother and her disabled daughter sat in the dark. Imagine the fear of a mother like Sheila, realizing too late that the man who promised a haven was actually a monster, and knowing that her daughter was entirely defenseless. It is an image of profound cruelty that remains one of the darkest aspects of the John Robinson case. The final victim to fall into Robinson's digital trap was Suzette Troughton. Suzette was 27 years old, a licensed practical nurse from Michigan. She was a vibrant, compassionate woman who loved her family, her friends, and her beloved Pekingese dogs. She was a traveler at heart, a woman who was always looking for the next adventure. In 1999, she met Robinson in a BDSM chat room. Robinson offered her a job as his traveling companion. He told her that he was assisting his elderly father, whom he called Papa John, in closing down several businesses. He claimed that they would be traveling extensively, even overseas to Europe, and that he needed a nurse to care for the elderly man. He offered her a staggering salary of $60,000 a year. To a young nurse who loved to travel, it sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. Suzette told her mother, Carolyn, that she was finally going to see the world. She completed a passport application, and researched colleges in Switzerland and Belgium where she could take classes during their travels. In February 2000, Suzette left for Kansas, bringing along her 2 dogs and a moving truck that Robinson had rented for her. At first, she communicated with her friends and family daily using the instant messaging program ICQ. But by March 1st, the tone of her messages began to change. She called her mother at work at 1 a.m., saying that she and Robinson were leaving on their big trip later that morning. Carolyn Troughton never saw or spoke to her daughter again, but Robinson had underestimated Carolyn Troughton. Carolyn wasn't a woman who would accept a typed letter or a vague excuse. When the emails from Suzette's account began to sound cold, detached, and filled with strange grammar, Carolyn's maternal instincts screamed that something was wrong. She knew her daughter's heart, and she knew that the person sending those messages was not Suzette. Carolyn refused to let her daughter become another ghost in Robinson's machine. She began a relentless campaign to find the truth. She tracked Suzette's belongings, she contacted the police, and she pointed them directly toward the man in Olathe, Kansas. In June 2000, the digital mask finally slipped, and the physical reality of John Edward Robinson's world was revealed to a horrified nation. Acting on the persistent reports from Carolyn Troughton and other concerned family members, police secured a search warrant for Robinson's farm in La Signy, Kansas. The summer heat was oppressive that day as investigators began to comb through the property. On a remote part of the farm, they found 2 massive 85-gallon chemical drums sitting in the sun. When the lids were pried off, the stench of death filled the heavy summer air. Inside those barrels were the remains of Suzette Troughton and Isabel Luica. The traveling companion and the art student had been folded into cold metal cylinders and left to rot. The discovery at the farm sent shockwaves through the community, but the investigation was far from over. Detectives quickly linked Robinson to a storage unit he had rented in Raymore, Missouri. When they opened the door to that unit, they found 3 more barrels. Inside were the remains of Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Debbie Faith. The scene was so gruesome that it traumatized the seasoned investigators who uncovered it. They saw the wheelchair parts mixed with the remains of a 15-year-old girl. They saw the personal belongings that women had packed for what they thought was a journey to a better life, now serving as the only identifiers in a serial killer's collection. 5 women, 5 distinct futures, all reduced to biological evidence because of one man's pathological need for control. The trial of John Edward Robinson was a descent into the cold heart of a narcissist. It became the longest criminal trial in Kansas history. Robinson sat at the defense table, looking like a retired accountant, showing a complete and bored indifference to the proceedings. He showed no remorse, no flicker of humanity, even as the details of his depravity were laid bare for the jury. The most powerful and emotional moment of the trial came when the story of Lisa Stasi's daughter was revealed. The courtroom was silent as the jury learned that baby Tiffany, now a 15-year-old named Heather Robinson, had been raised by the killer's own brother in Chicago. Heather had to learn that the man she had known as Uncle John was the man who had murdered her mother and stolen her identity. The emotional earthquake that hit that young girl is a weight that is almost impossible to comprehend. But Lisa Stasi's legacy lived on through her daughter, a living testament to a mother's love and a survivor who would spend her adult life ensuring her mother was never forgotten. Robinson was found guilty on 3 counts of capital murder in Kansas and was sentenced to death. 2 years later, as part of a plea agreement to avoid further death sentences in Missouri, he admitted responsibility for 5 additional murders and received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Today, he remains on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, an old man whose name is spoken only as a warning. But the true legacy of this story is not about the man in the prison cell. It is about the women whose voices were silenced. We must remember them not as victims in barrels, but as the vibrant, hopeful human beings they were. Think of the internet slave master handle. It wasn't just a screen name, it was a manifesto. It was the way he viewed every woman he met as something to be owned. But he was the one who was truly a slave to his own greed, his own lust for power, and his own pathological inability to see other people as human. He built a kingdom of barrels and forged signatures, but it was a kingdom built on sand. When the tide of truth finally came in, it washed everything away, leaving him with nothing but an orange jumpsuit and a cell. The emotional core of this story is the weight, the 15 years of silence, the 15 years of a family wondering if their daughter is in another state, or another country, or just another room. The pain of receiving a letter that looks like her handwriting, but doesn't sound like her voice. The way that hope can become a weapon in the hands of a man like Robinson. He didn't just kill his victims once. He killed them every day for 15 years through the silence he imposed on their families. But that silence is over. Let us remember Paula Guyleen Godfrey, a 19-year-old girl who was so eager to learn. Let us remember Lisa Stasi, a young mother who fought with everything she had. Let us remember Catherine Frances Clampett, a woman of spirit who was brave enough to seek a new beginning. Let us remember Isabel Lewicka, the artist from Poland who brought her creativity to a new country. Let us remember Beverly Bonner, the quiet librarian who loved books. Let us remember Sheila Faith, the mother whose devotion to her disabled daughter was absolute. And let us remember Debbie Faith, the 15-year-old girl who deserved a life filled with dignity and care. And let us remember Suzette Troughton, the vibrant nurse whose mother's fierce love finally brought a monster to justice. They were daughters, they were sisters, they were dreamers, and they were the center of people's universes. John Edward Robinson tried to erase them from existence, to turn them into digital ghosts. But the truth is a stubborn thing. It rises from the Kansas soil, it speaks through the storage units, and it lives on in the hearts of the families who never stopped looking. The barrels are empty, the secrets are out, and the women are finally, eternally free. Their names are the final word, their lives are the ultimate truth, and in that truth, there is a peace that no evil can ever touch again. In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the neighbors on Golden West Avenue saw a family that seemed merely private, perhaps a bit eccentric, but ultimately unremarkable. They saw Clark Wiley, a man who worked as a machinist, a man who kept his lawn trimmed and his windows shut. They saw his wife, Irene, a woman who suffered from worsening cataracts, eventually becoming almost entirely blind. They knew they had a son, but few realized there was another child, a daughter who had been erased from the world before she ever had the chance to step into it. The story of Genie Wiley is not just a case study in psychology or a footnote in linguistics. It is a harrowing descent into the absolute limits of human endurance and the systemic failure of a society that discovered a miracle and then didn't know how to keep it alive. To understand the gravity of what happened to Genie, we must first look into the mind of the man who built her prison. Clark Wiley was a man haunted by a profound, pathological hatred of noise. He was a man who had been shaped by a childhood of abandonment, and a mother he idolized to the point of obsession. When his mother was killed by a hit-and-run driver in 1958, something in Clark snapped. He retreated into a world of silence, and he demanded that everyone around him inhabit that same void. He decided that the world was a dangerous, loud, and unforgiving place, and he would protect his family by sealing them away from it. But for his daughter, Genie, this protection became a death sentence for her soul. Genie was born in 1957, a healthy baby at first, but a bout of illness and a slow development led a doctor to offhandedly suggest she might be retarded. In the twisted logic of Clark Wiley, this was a confirmation of his worst fears. He didn't see a child who needed extra care. He saw a broken machine that needed to be hidden. He took his 20-month-old daughter and led her into a small second-floor bedroom at the back of the house. He shut the door, and for the next 13 years, that door would stay closed. The room was a tomb. The windows were covered with layers of brown paper and aluminum foil, blocking out the sight of the trees, the sky, and the neighborhood children playing just yards away. There was no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls, and no toys. There was only a small window that was left cracked just a few inches to let in air, through which Genie could only see a tiny patch of the house next door. The furniture was minimal, a cage-like crib covered in wire mesh and a child's potty chair. This potty chair would become the center of Genie's universe. Every morning, Clark would strap her into the chair using a harness he had fashioned himself. She would sit there, her arms and legs bound, staring at the wall for hours on end. She was not allowed to move. She was not allowed to speak. She was not even allowed to cry. Clark Wiley's obsession with silence was enforced through a reign of terror that is difficult to fathom. He never spoke to his daughter. He never used words to express anger or instruction. Instead, he would stand outside her door and bark or growl like a predatory dog. If Genie made any sound, a whimper, a cough, a scratch of her fingernails against the chair, Clark would enter the room with a wooden board. He would not speak, he would simply beat her until the silence returned. He kept a loaded shotgun in the house, using it to intimidate his wife and son, ensuring they never interfered with the thing in the back room. Genie's brother was ordered never to speak to her. Her mother, trapped in her own world of darkness and fear, was allowed only a few minutes a day to feed her daughter, usually baby food or cereal, mashed into a paste so Genie wouldn't have to chew. Because she was never given solid food, her jaw never developed. Because she was never allowed to stand, her spine became curved and her muscles atrophied. She existed in a state of suspended animation, a human being stripped of every sensory input that makes life worth living. For 13 years, the only sounds she heard were the growls of her father and the muffled noises of a world she didn't know she belonged to. The rescue of Genie Wiley was not the result of a heroic police raid or a neighbor's tip. It was a fluke of fate. On November 4th, 1970, Irene Wiley finally reached her breaking point. After a violent argument with Clark, she took Genie and walked out of the house. She was heading to a social services office in Temple City, not to report child abuse, but to seek financial aid for her blindness. When they walked into the lobby, the atmosphere changed instantly. The social workers didn't see a blind woman and her child. They saw a ghost. Genie was 13 years old, but she weighed only 59 pounds. She stood only 4 feet 8 inches tall. She walked with a strange hopping bunny gait, her hands held up in front of her as if she were feeling for obstacles in a world she couldn't understand. She was incontinent, she spat constantly, and she was completely silent. She didn't look at people, she looked through them. The authorities were called, and the house on Golden West Avenue was finally opened to the light. Clark Wiley was arrested, but he would never face the justice of a courtroom. On the morning his trial was set to begin, he sat down in his home, typed a note that read, "The world will never understand," and ended his own life. He took his secrets and his reasons to the grave, leaving Genie behind to pick up the pieces of a life he had systematically destroyed. Genie was taken to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and it was there that she became the center of what is now known as the Forbidden Experiment. The scientific community was electrified. For centuries, philosophers and linguists had wondered what would happen if a human being grew up without language. Would they still be human? Would they have a sense of self? Would they be able to learn to speak if they missed the critical period of development? Genie was the answer to all these questions, or so they thought. A team of experts was assembled: Dr. James Kent, a pediatrician, Susan Curtis, a linguistics student, David Rigler, a psychologist, and Victoria Fromkin, a world-renowned linguist. They were faced with a child who was physically 13 but developmentally an infant. She had to be taught how to eat, how to wear clothes, how to use a toilet, but most of all, she had to be taught how to communicate. The early months were a miracle of progress. Genie, freed from her harness in her tomb, blossomed. She was intensely curious. She would reach out and touch everything: the fabric of a dress, the cold metal of a spoon, the skin of a person's hand. She seemed to be trying to make up for 13 years of sensory deprivation in a single day. Susan Curtis, who became Genie's primary language teacher, discovered that Genie had a profound intelligence that defied her lack of speech. Genie began to learn words at an incredible rate. She learned the names of colors, of shapes, of emotions. She had a special affinity for the color yellow, and she would find joy in a simple yellow balloon or a plastic toy. But as the months turned into years, a troubling pattern emerged. While Genie could learn hundreds of words, she couldn't seem to grasp the rules of grammar. She could say applesauce buy store, but she couldn't say, "I want to buy some applesauce at the store." Her sentences remained telegraphic, a string of nouns and verbs without the connective tissue of syntax. This led to a groundbreaking and heartbreaking discovery. Because Genie had not been exposed to language during her first 13 years, the left hemisphere of her brain, the part responsible for grammar, had effectively shut down. She was using her right brain to communicate, a feat of neural plasticity that was amazing, but ultimately limited. The window of language had not slammed shut, but it had narrowed to a sliver. However, the Tenebris of the Genie Wiley story isn't just found in her childhood room. It is found in the way the scientific community treated her as she grew. There was an inherent conflict at the heart of the Genie project. Was she a patient to be healed or a subject to be studied? The National Institute of Mental Health provided the funding, but they wanted results. They wanted papers, data, and breakthroughs. The scientists were under immense pressure to prove that their forbidden experiment was yielding scientific fruit. This led to a blurring of ethical lines. David Rigler and his wife took Genie into their own home to live as foster parents. While this provided Genie with a stable family environment for the first time in her life, it also meant that her primary caregivers were also her primary researchers. Every meal, every walk in the park, and every emotional breakthrough was recorded, analyzed, and filed away. The wild child was never truly free. She had simply moved from a private cage to a public one, where the bars were made of observation logs and recording tapes. The internal politics of the research team began to fracture. There were disagreements about her treatment, about who should have access to her, and about the direction of the study. A teacher named Jean Butler became obsessed with Genie, attempting to isolate her from the rest of the team, and even trying to adopt her. She claimed the researchers were vultures who were overworking the girl. The hospital eventually barred Butler from seeing Genie, but the damage was done. The atmosphere of care was being poisoned by professional ego and academic ambition. The NIMH delivered the final blow. They decided that the research on Genie was not rigorous enough. They claimed the data was anecdotal, and that the team had failed to produce the kind of objective scientific proof they required. They cut the funding. Almost overnight, the team that had been Genie's world for 4 years was disbanded. The project was over, and because the project was over, the system decided that Genie was no longer a priority. This is the moment where the story of Genie Wiley shifts from a tragedy of abuse to a tragedy of institutional indifference. With the funding gone, the Riglers could no longer keep Genie in their home. At 18 years old, Genie was moved back into the custody of her mother, Irene. But Irene, still blind and still haunted by the ghost of Clark Wiley, was overwhelmed. She couldn't handle the complex needs of a daughter who was an adult in body, but a child in mind. Genie was then moved into the foster care system, the very system that is supposed to protect the vulnerable. But for Genie, foster care was a return to the nightmare. In one home, she was subjected to severe physical punishment for a simple accident. She had vomited, and the foster parents, in an attempt to teach her a lesson, forced her to look at it for hours. The trauma was a psychological trigger that sent Genie spiraling back into the silence of her childhood. She had learned that speaking led to punishment. She stopped talking. The progress of 5 years was erased in a single afternoon of cruelty. The legal system added its own layer of darkness. Irene Wiley, encouraged by lawyers, filed a lawsuit against the researchers and the hospital. She accused them of exploiting her daughter for prestige and profit. She claimed they had used Genie as a guinea pig and had failed to provide her with the long-term care she needed. The lawsuit dragged on for years, creating a wall between Genie and the people who had genuinely loved her, like Susan Curtis. Curtis was forbidden from seeing Genie, a separation that she describes as one of the great sorrows of her life. The girl who had been the most studied child in history was now being hidden away again, not by foil on the windows, but by legal injunctions and non-disclosure agreements. The forbidden experiment had ended not with an answer, but with a gag order. Genie's adult life became a series of moves between state-run facilities and private boarding care homes. She became a ward of the state, a number in a ledger. The girl who had once fascinated the world with her ability to learn yellow and big was now just another patient in a crowded system. There were occasional reports of her status. In the 1980s and 90s, investigators found her in facilities that were described as dreary and unstimulating. She was seen sitting in corners, rocking back and forth, her hands once again held up in that bunny gait. She had lost almost all of her language. The window that had been cracked open by Susan Curtis and her team, had finally, mercifully or cruelly, slammed shut. Genie had returned to the silence. It was as if the 13 years in the room had established a baseline of existence that her brain simply couldn't escape. The trauma was too deep. As we look at the case of Genie Wiley from the perspective of the year 2026, we have to ask what we have learned. We learned that the human brain is incredibly resilient, but it is not infinite. We learned that language is not just a skill. It is a fundamental part of our humanity that must be nurtured in the light of social interaction. But more importantly, we learned about the fragility of our own compassion. The story of Genie is a warning about what happens when we treat people as cases rather than as individuals. The scientists who studied her were not evil people. They were brilliant, dedicated individuals who wanted to help. But they were working within a structure that valued the answer more than the person. When the answer became too difficult to find, the person became a burden. We failed Genie because we tried to solve her like a puzzle, instead of loving her like a daughter. The house on Golden West Avenue still stands. It has been sold and repainted, and new families have moved in and out. The room at the back of the house, once the site of 13 years of absolute darkness, is now likely a bedroom for a child who can speak, who can cry, and who can run into the sunshine whenever they please. But for Genie, the room never truly went away. She carried it with her in the way she walked, the way she looked at the world, and the way she eventually retreated back into the quiet. She is now in her late 60s, living in an undisclosed location in Southern California. She is a silent elder, a woman who has lived a life that is almost impossible to imagine. She is the living embodiment of a question that we are still afraid to answer. What happens to a soul when it is denied the right to be known? In the final minutes of this deep dive, we must reflect on the small moments of beauty that Genie did experience. We must remember her joy at seeing a fire truck, her fascination with the way water felt on her skin, and her deep wordless connection to the people who sat on the floor with her and tried to bridge the gap. Genie Wiley was not a failure of biology. She was a victim of a failure of empathy. Her story is a Tenebris of the highest order because it reminds us that the dark isn't just a place without light. It is a place without a voice. As the screen fades to black, let us remember the girl who loved yellow, and let us vow to listen for the silences in our own world, so that no child is ever left to bark at the door of their own life. This is the tragic, definitive history of Genie, the girl who was found, studied, and lost again, leaving us with a silence that should haunt us forever. The ethical legacy of the forbidden experiment continues to shape how we conduct research today. Because of Genie, we have stricter rules about the dual roles of researchers. We have institutional review boards that are supposed to ensure that the well-being of the subject is always the primary concern. But these are just rules on paper. The real lesson is one of the heart. Genie was a miracle because despite everything, she wanted to connect. She reached out, she tried, she gave the world a chance to be better, and the world, in its bureaucracy, its academic pride, and its legal coldness, wasn't ready for her. Her story is a mirror that shows us our own capacity for both incredible discovery and devastating neglect. She remains the wild child of Arcadia, a ghost in the machine of modern science, a woman who found the light for a brief, beautiful moment before the shadows claimed her once again. And in that silence, if we listen closely, we can still hear the echo of a girl who just wanted to say, yellow. At 6:24 p.m., a grainy security camera captured a scene so ordinary, it almost looked like a father greeting his daughter. A man in a blue mechanic's uniform walks up to an 11-year-old girl in a bright pink shirt. He says a few words, he reaches out, he takes her by the arm and leads her into the shadows. It took exactly 12 seconds. In those 12 seconds, Carlie Brucia didn't just vanish from a Florida car wash. She became the face of every parent's darkest nightmare and the center of a manhunt that would expose a shattering failure in the American justice system. This isn't just a story about a kidnapping. It's a forensic autopsy of the moment innocence meets a predator who was never supposed to be on the street. The air in Sarasota on February 1st, 2004, held that specific, heavy stillness that precedes a change in the season. It was a Sunday, and for 11-year-old Carlie Brucia, the world was measured in the short distances between safety and friendship. She had spent the day at a friend's house, doing the things 11-year-old girls do, sharing secrets, laughing at inside jokes, and ignoring the inevitable ticking of the clock that signaled the end of the weekend. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the Florida sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, Carlie started her walk home. It was a journey of less than a mile, a path she had navigated before, a stretch of suburban landscape that felt as familiar as the hallway of her own school. She was wearing a bright pink shirt, a color of defiance against the encroaching gray of the evening, her backpack slung over her shoulders as she navigated the sidewalks and the fringes of parking lots. To understand the weight of what happened next, one must understand the geography of the mundane. Carlie wasn't in a dark alley or a deserted forest. She was in the heart of a community, walking past businesses and beneath streetlights. She reached a car wash located on Bee Ridge Road, a place of high visibility and constant transition. For a child, a shortcut behind such a building is a logical choice, a way to shave 3 minutes off a walk, a way to get home just a little bit sooner to the family waiting for her. But as Carlie stepped into the shadow of the car wash, she stepped out of the world of the ordinary and into a space where a predator had been lying in wait, perhaps not for her specifically, but for the opportunity she unknowingly represented. The security camera mounted on the wall of the car wash was a silent, unblinking witness. It was old technology, even for 2004, grainy, flickering, and yellowed by the sodium lights, but it captured a sequence of events that would eventually be burned into the collective memory of the American public. At exactly 6:24 p.m., the footage shows Carlie walking into the frame. She isn't running. She isn't looking over her shoulder. She is simply a child moving toward her future. Then, from the opposite side of the frame, a figure appears, a man in a dark work shirt, his silhouette blocky and imposing. He doesn't lurk. He approaches her with a terrifying directness. There is a moment where they stand together in the frame, a small girl in a pink shirt, and a grown man in a mechanic's uniform. It looks, for a fleeting second, like a conversation between a father and a daughter, or perhaps a neighbor offering directions. But the body language tells a different story. The man reaches out and takes Carlie by the arm. There is no frantic struggle, no cinematic chase. There is only the chilling sight of a child being led away by a stranger, her steps hesitant but compliant, disappearing into the grainy darkness beyond the camera's reach. It took 12 seconds. In the time it takes to draw a few deep breaths, Carlie Brucia was gone. When Carlie didn't walk through the front door, the atmosphere in her home shifted from casual expectation to sharp, needle-like anxiety. Phone calls were made, neighbors were consulted, and eventually, the police were summoned. In the beginning, there was the flickering hope of a misunderstanding. Perhaps she had gone back to her friend's house. Perhaps she had taken a different route and gotten lost. But as the night wore on and the silence from the streets grew louder, that hope began to erode. By the time investigators reviewed the footage from the car wash the next morning, the reality of the situation crashed down with the force of a tidal wave. They weren't looking for a runaway. They were looking for a kidnapper who had left behind a visual confession. The release of the video to the media was an act of desperation and strategy. The authorities knew they needed a name, and they needed it before the trail went cold. The footage played on a loop on every news station, a haunting, silent movie that left viewers cold. The man in the video became the most hunted individual in Florida. He wore a uniform with a patch, a detail that led police to contact hundreds of local businesses, asking for employee rosters and uniform styles. They were looking for a mechanic, a technician, someone who moved through the world under the guise of being a helpful professional. But while the police were checking business licenses, the people who actually knew the man were watching their television screens with a growing sense of horror. They didn't see a suspect. They saw Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was a man whose life was a mosaic of failures and missed warnings. A 37-year-old father and mechanic, Smith was well known to the legal system. His history was a long, dark corridor of drug arrests, probation violations, and flashes of impulsive aggression. He was a man fueled by the desperate chemistry of cocaine and heroin, someone who lived in the margins of society despite having a family and a trade. At the time he grabbed Carlie, he was a walking failure of the justice system. He had violated his probation multiple times, yet he remained on the streets, a predator whose escalations had been ignored by a system focused on the paperwork of his addiction rather than the danger of his character. When his own brother saw the video, the recognition was instant. The gait, the clothes, the build, it was unmistakably Joseph. The call was made to the authorities, and the net began to tighten. The search for Carlie during those first few days was a Herculean effort that galvanized the entire state. Thousands of volunteers took to the streets, tramping through the thick Florida brush, peering into drainage ditches, and searching abandoned buildings. Posters featuring Carlie's smiling face were everywhere, a stark contrast to the grainy image of her being led away. The FBI joined local law enforcement, bringing in high-tech surveillance and behavioral analysts. But as Joseph Smith sat in an interrogation room, he remained a stone wall. He was a man who knew the system, who knew how to play the game of silence. He didn't offer a confession. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He sat in the cold light of the station, a man who had stolen a life and seemed entirely indifferent to the grief he had unleashed. As the clock ticked past 72 hours, the investigative focus shifted. They weren't just looking for Carlie anymore. They were retracing Smith's movements with surgical precision. They used cell phone pings and witness statements to map his route on the night of February 1st. The map led them away from the bright lights of the car wash and toward the quieter, more desolate parts of the county. Specifically, it led them to the grounds of the Central Church of Christ. It was a place that should have represented sanctuary and peace, but in the early hours of February 5th, it became a site of profound tragedy. Following the leads generated by Smith's associates and his own eventual coerced directions, investigators moved into the wooded area behind the church. The discovery was a moment of silence that echoed across the country. Carlie was found beneath the low-hanging branches of the Florida pines. The bright pink shirt that had been her beacon of identity was now a shroud. The medical examiner's report would later detail the brutality of her end. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The realization that she had likely been killed within hours of her abduction added a layer of bitter irony to the massive search effort. While the city had been praying for her return, she had already been gone, her life extinguished by a man who had seen her only as an object for his own dark impulses. The grief that hit Sarasota was visceral. It wasn't just the loss of a child, it was the loss of the illusion that their world was safe. The legal proceedings against Joseph Smith were a long, arduous journey through the mechanics of justice. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence, centered primarily on the car wash video, which acted as an anchor for the entire case. DNA evidence linked Smith directly to the crime scene, and the testimony of his brother and acquaintances painted a picture of a man who had spiraled out of control. Smith's defense team tried to lean into his drug addiction, arguing that he was in a state of diminished capacity, a man so clouded by narcotics that he didn't understand the gravity of his actions. They tried to turn a predator into a victim of his own biology, but the jury saw through the smoke. They watched the video. They saw the deliberation in his movements, the way he waited for the right moment, and the way he led her away with the cold efficiency of a hunter. In late 2005, the verdict came in, guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was equally intense, with Carlie's mother, Susan Shorpen, delivering a victim impact statement that laid bare the shredded remains of her life. She spoke of the birthdays that would never happen, the milestones that were stolen, and the empty chair at the dinner table that would forever be a monument to Joseph Smith's cruelty. The jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. Smith was sent to death row, a place where he would spend the next 15 years filing appeals and lingering in the limbo of the legal system. But the story didn't end with a gavel. The legacy of Carlie Brucia became a catalyst for systemic change. Her death exposed the gaping holes in Florida's probation and parole systems. It led to the creation of Carlie's Law, which mandated that probationers who committed technical violations like failing a drug test or missing a meeting would be treated with much higher scrutiny if they had a history of violence or kidnapping. It was a movement born of the realization that Joseph Smith should never have been on that sidewalk on February 1st. He was a man who had been given 1,000 chances to do better, and he used every one of them to move closer to his ultimate crime. The cultural impact was just as significant. The car wash video became a staple of true crime documentaries and police training seminars, a textbook example of how quickly a life can be altered. It changed the way parents spoke to their children about safety. The old adage of "don't talk to strangers" was replaced by a more complex understanding of situational awareness. People began to look at car washes, parking lots, and shortcuts through different eyes. The innocence of the suburban landscape had been permanently stained by the image of that blue work shirt and that pink shirt disappearing into the shadows together. As the years passed, the tragedy continued to ripple through the lives of those involved. Carlie's mother, Susan, struggled with the immense weight of her grief, her life becoming a public struggle with the trauma of her daughter's death. She became a symbol of a parent's worst nightmare, a woman who had to grieve in the glare of the national spotlight. When Joseph Smith finally died in prison in 2021, not by the hand of the state, but by natural causes in a prison infirmary, it felt like a quiet, unsatisfying end to a loud and violent story. There was no final apology, no grand moment of closure. There was only the expiration of a man who had caused an immeasurable amount of pain. The level of detail required to understand this case requires looking at the minutes between 6:00 p.m. and midnight on that fateful Sunday. Smith wasn't just driving, he was hunting. Witnesses later came forward, describing a station wagon matching Smith's circling the area, a predator scouting the boundaries of the neighborhood. This detail is crucial because it shatters the defense's argument of a drug-induced fog. A man in a fog does not circle a block waiting for the perfect gap in traffic. A man in a fog does not choose a location hidden from the main road, but visible enough to maintain control. Smith was precise, he was calculated, and he was fast. The psychological toll on the lead detectives, many of whom were parents themselves, cannot be overstated. They were forced to watch that 12-second clip hundreds of times, looking for a pixelated clue, a glint of a ring, the specific wear pattern on a boot, the way the name tag on the shirt crinkled. They lived in that car wash through the screen, desperately wishing they could reach through the glass and pull Carlie back. That emotional weight carried through the trial, where the courtroom was often thick, with a silence so heavy it felt physical. To look back at the case of Carlie Brucia is to look at a moment in time where everything went wrong in the most public way possible. It is a story of a child who did nothing more than walk home, and a man who did nothing less than destroy a community's sense of peace. The church where she was found remains a place of worship, but it also stands as a silent memorial to a girl who was taken too soon. The car wash still operates, cars still pull in and out of the bays, and the cameras are still rolling, higher resolution now, more numerous, but still searching for the same thing, the safety that was lost in 12 seconds on a Sunday evening. We tell this story not because we find beauty in the tragedy, but because the memory of Carlie Brucia demands it. Her name is a shield for other children, her story a warning for a system that often forgets the human cost of its leniency. When we watch that grainy footage, we aren't just seeing a crime, we are seeing a reflection of our own vulnerability. We see the bright pink shirt as a symbol of innocence, and the man in the blue shirt as the darkness that always waits at the edges of the light. Carlie Brucia's journey ended in the woods behind a church, but her presence remains in every law passed in her name, in every parent who holds their child's hand a little tighter, and in every 12-second interval that passes without a shadow falling across the frame. It is a long road from that car wash to justice, and though the man is gone, the echo of Carlie's footsteps still rings in the ears of a nation that promised to never let it happen again.